Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day you've just finished carrying, you can set it down now. Find the position that feels easiest. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There is nothing left for you to solve tonight. There is nothing left for you to decide. All you have to do is listen and drift and let the story carry you the rest of the way. Before we begin, I want to say a quiet thank you to Lou, who sent in tonight's idea. This one belongs to you. Now settle in, let your breathing slow, and come with me into the dark. I want you to picture a valley. It is late, and the air is cold in the way that mountain air gets cold, thin and clean and faintly metallic. The kind of cold that makes the stars look sharper than they have any right to be. The valley floor is green in the daytime, soft with grass and low trees, but at this hour it is only shape and shadow. There are no streetlights here. There are no billboards. There is not even a radio station within 100 miles, because that was the entire point of choosing this place. And in the middle of the valley, rising out of the darkness like something left behind by a civilization that no longer exists, there is a dish. It is enormous, larger than a cathedral. A bowl of white steel wide enough to hold a football field, tilted upward at a patient angle, held aloft by a lattice of girders and cables that creak very slightly when the wind moves through them. Nothing about it looks alive, and yet it moves. Slowly. So slowly that if you stood beside it and watched, you would not be able to see the motion at all. You would only notice, after a long while, that the dish was pointed somewhere it had not been pointed before. It is tracking something. It has been tracking the same thing for a very long time. Inside a low concrete building at the edge of the valley, there is a room with no windows, and in that room there are men and women who are paid to listen. They do not talk much. There is not much to say. The work is mostly waiting, and waiting is a quiet profession. On the desks there are cups of coffee going cold. On the walls there are clocks showing the time in 4 cities, and on a bank of instruments needles trace long, flat, uneventful lines across slowly rolling paper. Noise. Nothing but noise. The hiss of hydrogen atoms drifting between the stars. The faint hum of the universe cooling down after its own beginning. The crackle of a lightning storm on a planet nobody has ever visited. Static and static and static, filling the room like water filling a basin. And then, on a night in 1977, the needles stopped being uneventful. You would not have heard anything if you'd been standing there. The signal is far too high in frequency for human ears, and even if you converted it into sound, it would come across as a thin electronic warble, something like a modem waking up, something like a bird calling in a language with no birds in it. But the instruments hear it. The instruments hear it perfectly. It comes in narrow. That is the first thing anyone notices, and it is the thing that makes the room go still. Natural objects in space are loud, but they are loud across an enormous range of frequencies at once, the way a bonfire throws heat in every direction. A star does not whisper into a single channel. A pulsar does not select a frequency and stay there. Only technology does that. Only something that wants to be efficient does that. A narrowband signal is the fingerprint of intent, and every person in that room has spent their entire career hoping to see one, and now that it is happening, nobody in the room says a word. The signal holds for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. It does not drift. It does not fade in and out the way local interference does when a truck goes by on the highway or a satellite passes overhead. It rides the sky, tracking with the rotation of the Earth, which is the polite way of saying that it is not coming from here. It is coming from out there, from a fixed point among the fixed stars holding steady while our planet turns beneath it. And then it stops, not fading, not weakening, stopping, the way a door closes. Somebody finally speaks. Somebody asks whether it will repeat. Because that is what everyone was trained to expect. A beacon repeats. A beacon says the same thing over and over, patiently, for for years, for centuries, because a beacon exists to be found by someone who is not yet listening. That is what a greeting looks like. A greeting is repetition. They point the dish back at those coordinates the following night, and the night after, and the night after that. Nothing. They point it back a month later, and a year later, and a decade later. They will go on pointing it back for the rest of their lives, quietly, in hours borrowed from other projects, on nights when nobody is checking the logs. It never comes again. One transmission. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. And then a silence that has now lasted longer than most of the people in that room ended up living. But that is not the part of the story that matters. The part that matters happens over the following 4 years, in a different building, in a different country, in a room with a lock on the door and a list of names taped beside it. Because the signal was not noise. Underneath the carrier wave, threaded through the timing of the pulses, there was structure, mathematics. And mathematics is the one language that does not need a translator, because a prime number is a prime number in every corner of the universe, and the ratio of a circle to its own diameter does not care what kind of body you happen to be wearing. So they worked, slowly, with paper and with early computers and with the kind of stubbornness that only comes from people who understand exactly how much is at stake. They mapped the structure, they found the framing sequence, they found the counting layer underneath it, the part that established what a number was, so that everything above it could be understood. And then, 4 years after the night in the valley, a scientist sat alone at a desk at 3 a.m, with a sheet of paper in front of her, and she stopped writing. Her colleague, who had fallen asleep in a chair by the door, woke up because of the quality of the silence. He asked her if she had it. She said yes. He asked her what it said. And she did not answer him for a long moment. She was looking at the paper the way you look at something you would very much like to be wrong about. Then she said, quietly, without any drama in her voice at all, that this was not a greeting. He asked what it was, and she said it was an obituary. Sleep well and stay with me. Because to understand what she meant, we have to go back much further, to a lunch table in the desert, and a question so simple that it should never have been able to frighten anybody. The summer of 1950. Los Alamos, New Mexico. A place built for one purpose, tucked up on a mesa where the air is dry and the sky goes on forever. 4 physicists are walking to lunch. They have been talking about flying saucers, because everyone in America is talking about flying saucers that year, and because physicists enjoy being amused by things. There has been a cartoon in a magazine blaming little green men for a rash of stolen trash cans in New York City. The men laugh about it. They speculate, half seriously, about whether faster-than-light travel might be possible. Then the conversation moves on to other things, the way lunch conversations do. They sit down. Somebody talks about the menu. Time passes. And then, out of nowhere, in the middle of an entirely unrelated subject, one of them looks up and asks a question. Where is everybody? The other 3 burst out laughing, because they know exactly what he means. He does not have to explain. That is what happens when very intelligent people share a context. He means the galaxy. He means the fact that our galaxy contains something in the region of 200 billion stars, and that the universe is old, unimaginably old, so old that our own sun is a latecomer to it, a 2nd or 3rd generation star built out of the ashes of stars that lived and died before the Earth had even been imagined. He means that there has been time. That is the whole of it. There has been so much time. Think about it the way he thought about it, lying there in the dark and let the numbers stay soft and blurred, because it is not the arithmetic that matters, it is the shape of it. Our galaxy is roughly 100,000 light-years across. That sounds impossibly wide, and it is. But a civilization does not need to cross it in a single leap. It only needs to send out a few ships. Those ships arrive somewhere and settle, and after a few thousand years those settlements send out a few ships of their own. And those send out more, even at a crawl, even at 1% of the speed of light, which is slow enough that we could very nearly manage it with technology, we can already sketch on paper, the whole galaxy fills up in something like 10 million years. Perhaps 50 million if you're pessimistic and assume long pauses and false starts and civilizations that lose interest for a few thousand years at a time. And the galaxy is roughly 13 billion years old. 10 million years against 13 billion years. It is the difference between an afternoon and a lifetime. If a single technological species had arisen anywhere in the Milky Way at any point in the last few billion years, and if that species had done nothing more ambitious than what we can already imagine ourselves doing, then their descendants should be everywhere by now, in every system, on every reasonable world. Their machinery should be visible from here. Their waste heat should be glowing in our infrared surveys. Their probes should be sitting in our asteroid belt, gathering dust, waiting. The sky should be crowded. Instead, the sky is empty, not quiet, empty. There is a difference, and it took us decades to understand how significant that difference is. That is the Fermi paradox, and it is not a fringe idea. It is one of the most serious unsolved problems in the whole of science, and the disturbing thing about it is that every possible solution is unsettling in its own particular way. Either life is far rarer than it looks, or intelligence is a freak accident that almost never happens twice, or technological civilizations reliably destroy themselves before they get very far, or they are out there and hiding, or they are out there and we are looking with the wrong eyes, or there is something else, something we have not thought of. For a while, nobody did anything about the question except argue about it, which is what usually happens with very large questions. And then, 10 years later, a young astronomer decided to stop arguing and start listening. His name was Frank Drake, and in the spring of 1960 he pointed an 85-foot radio telescope in Green Bank, West Virginia, at two nearby stars, Tau Ceti, Epsilon Eridani, both roughly 11 light-years away, both similar enough to our own sun that a person could imagine warm worlds turning somewhere in their light. He called it Project Ozma, after the princess in the Oz books, because he said it was a land far away, populated by exotic beings. He had almost no equipment, a single-channel receiver tuned near the frequency at which hydrogen sings, because hydrogen is the most common substance in the universe, and therefore the most obvious place for two strangers to agree to meet. 200 hours of observation across 4 months, a chart recorder, a loudspeaker, and a young man sitting in the cold at dawn with headphones on listening to the sky. On the very first morning he got a signal. Strong, pulsed, impossible to mistake. The needle slammed across the paper. The loudspeaker made a sound like something knocking on a door. For a few minutes Frank Drake believed he had done it on the first try. It was a passing aircraft, or a classified radar experiment. The accounts differ. But it was ours, whatever it was, and the lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life. The sky is full of our own noise. We are shouting into our own ears. Anyone who wants to hear something faint from very far away has to first learn to recognise the enormous racket that we ourselves are making. Project Ozma found nothing else. 4 months, 2 stars, silence. But it started something. Over the following decades, the search grew from one man with headphones into an international discipline. Bigger dishes, millions of channels instead of one, computers that could sift the entire radio spectrum at once, looking for anything narrow, anything artificial, anything with the fingerprint of intent. In Puerto Rico, they built the Great Dish at Arecibo, 1,000 feet across, slung inside a natural sinkhole in the limestone hills, with a platform of steel hanging above it on cables, suspended in the air like something dreamed rather than engineered. For 53 years it was the most sensitive radio ear on the planet. It listened to pulsars and mapped the surfaces of asteroids and stared at the sky for decades, and then in the winter of 2020 the cables let go and the whole platform came down into the bowl in a matter of seconds, and the great ear closed forever. In West Virginia at Green Bank they built something even stranger. A steerable dish larger than a city block, standing inside a legally enforced radio quiet zone, a region of the country where wireless internet is restricted and mobile phone towers are forbidden, and even the government cars that patrol the roads have to use diesel engines because the spark plugs in a petrol engine make too much noise. An entire landscape hushed on purpose. Thousands of square miles of enforced silence, so that one machine can hear something whispering from 10,000 light years away. In Australia, at parks, a dish sitting in a sheep paddock, so out of place among the grass and the fences that it looks like a prop from a film about the future. And in China, in a natural bowl among the karst hills of Guizhou province, they built the largest single dish ever attempted, 500 metres across, nearly twice the collecting area of Arecibo. They relocated entire villages to keep the valley quiet. They hung a receiver above it on 6 cables and let it move like a spider on a web. It came online and it began to listen. 6 decades of listening. Millions of hours. Thousands of stars. Machines of extraordinary sensitivity, capable of detecting a mobile phone signal at the distance of Saturn. And the official result of all of it, the summary you will find in any encyclopedia, is the same short sentence that has been true since Frank Drake first put on his headphones in the cold. We have never received a confirmed message. Hold that sentence in your mind for a moment as you drift. Look at it carefully. Because according to the conspiracy at the heart of tonight's story, that sentence is not a lie. It is worse than a lie. It is technically true. Because a warning is not a message, an obituary is not a message, a countdown is not a message, and nobody, in 60 years of careful public language, has ever promised us that we did not receive one of those. Now come forward with me. All the way forward to a morning much closer to our own. Dr. Hannah Mercer is 41 years old, and she has spent most of her working life in rooms without windows, which is a strange thing for an astronomer to admit. People imagine that astronomers stand outside at night with their eyes turned upward and their breath fogging in the cold. Almost none of them do. Modern astronomy is a desk job. The sky arrives as numbers. You spend your career staring at a screen in a warm room while a machine on a mountain somewhere does the actual looking. She has made peace with that. She likes the numbers. She has always been the sort of person who finds the pattern in a page of noise, who notices when a lecturer has skipped a step, who cannot leave a crooked picture frame alone. Her new position is an unglamorous one. An international consortium has decided to digitise and standardise 6 decades of archived radio survey data from observatories all over the world. Old magnetic tapes, reels of chart paper, early digital formats that no living software can open without being coaxed. Somebody has to go through it, catalogue it, cross-reference it, and turn it into something a modern computer can search. It is, on paper, the least exciting job in astronomy. It is data janitorial work. She takes it because the funding is stable, and because she suspects correctly that there are discoveries buried in that archive that nobody has ever gone back to look for, simply because no one had the patience. She sets up her workflow in the first week. Nothing complicated. A script that walks through every observing run, checks that the files are readable, verifies that the timestamps are continuous, and flags anything that looks corrupt. It is that last part that ruins her life. Because on the 11th day, the script starts producing gaps. Not corruption. Corruption looks like garbage, like a photograph with a torn corner, like a sentence with the letters scrambled. This is not that. This is absence. Clean, complete, tidy absence. An observing run that begins at 2200 hours and ends at 0600 hours, with a piece of the middle simply not present. The file numbering skips. 19, 20, 21, 25. No error, no damage, no note. She assumes a transcription mistake. Somebody in 1986 mislabeled a tape, or a technician, pulled a reel for maintenance and never put it back. It happens. Archives are held together with human beings, and human beings drop things, so she flags it and moves on. By the end of the month she has flagged 940 of them. That is when she stops assuming. She does what any careful person would do. She builds a map. Every gap, plotted by date, by observatory, and by the sky coordinates the telescope had been pointed at when the missing minutes should have been recorded. She expects a scatter. Random loss looks random. Random loss is spread across the sky like rain on a pavement. The plot comes up on her screen at 11 at night in an empty building, and she sits back in her chair and she does not move for a long time. It is not a scatter, it is a point. Almost every single missing file, across 940 gaps, across 6 decades, across 4 continents, corresponds to the telescope being aimed at the same small patch of sky. A region less than a degree across, smaller than the width of your thumbnail held at arm's length. A dull, ordinary, unremarkable corner of the constellation Cygnus, the Swan, which flies down the length of the Milky Way with its wings spread and its long neck pointed south. There is nothing there. That is the thing she keeps coming back to over the following days. There is genuinely nothing there. No famous nebula, no bright star worth naming. A few thousand distant suns, none of them notable, sitting in a stretch of the galactic plane so crowded and so dusty that most surveys treat it as background clutter. And yet, for 60 years, whenever a major radio telescope looked at that patch of sky, a piece of the recording went missing. She tells herself there could be an instrumental explanation. Perhaps a satellite crosses that region regularly and the interference gets automatically excised. Perhaps there is a data pipeline somewhere with an old filter in it that nobody has audited in 30 years. These are boring explanations, and boring explanations are almost always correct, and she wants very badly for one of them to be correct. So she checks the other observatories, not the consortium copies, the originals. She writes to colleagues she has not spoken to in years. Greenbank, Gaps, Parks in Australia, Gaps, the array in Chile, Gaps, the Great Dish in Guizhou province, which has only been operating for a handful of years and belongs to a country with no reason at all to coordinate its archival practices with anyone else. Gaps, the same coordinates, the same clean absence. South Africa, the Netherlands, India, Russia, gaps. Different governments, different funding bodies, different political systems, some of which have spent the last half-century actively trying to undermine each other. Different file formats, different software, different languages, different alphabets, and the same hole in the same place in the sky. She does one more test, and it is the test that takes the floor out from under her. She goes looking for the deletion itself, because deleting a file leaves a mark. It always does. A tape that has been erased and reused has a different magnetic history than one that has been written once. A digital file that has been removed leaves a shape in the index, a gap in the allocation table, a scar in the metadata. Deletion is violence, and violence leaves evidence. There is no evidence. What she finds instead, in the oldest records, in the physical logbook scanned page by page in somebody's careful handwriting, is a pattern of access. The tapes were not erased in place. They were signed out, checked out, formally, properly, by people whose signatures are in the ledger, and taken away for what the column marked purpose describes as calibration review, and then a second entry, days or weeks later, recording their return, except that when she cross-references the return entries against the physical inventory, the tapes that came back were not the tapes that went out. Different serial numbers, different manufacture dates, substitutions made openly, recorded honestly, hiding in plain sight inside a paperwork system so tedious that no one has ever read it end to end. Nothing was destroyed. Everything was collected. Somewhere, she realizes, sitting alone in a cold building at 2 a.m. with her hands flat on the desk, there is a complete archive. Every missing minute, every excised recording, 6 decades of observations, of one anonymous patch of the constellation Cygnus, gathered patiently from every major observatory on the planet and assembled into a single collection that only a very small number of people have ever been allowed to see. Someone has been curating this for 60 years, and the question she cannot put down, the one that follows her home and sits at the end of her bed and is still there when she wakes, is not who. It is why they left the gaps at all. Why go to the trouble of collecting the originals and substituting blanks, rather than simply fabricating replacement data? It would have been easy. It would have been undetectable. Any competent group could have generated 60 years of plausible noise and dropped it into the holes, and nobody would ever have noticed a thing. Unless the people doing it wanted the gaps to be findable by the right person, eventually. Unless the gaps were not a cover-up at all. Unless they were a message left for whoever finally cared enough to count them. She starts looking for money. That is the trick of it, and she learns it from a friend who works in policy rather than science. Secrets are very good at hiding. Money is not. Money has to be appropriated. It has to be authorised. It has to be signed for by somebody, and even when the details are hidden, the shape of the hole in the budget remains, like a footprint in snow. A government can classify what a programme does. It has a much harder time classifying the fact that a programme exists at all, because somewhere, in a ledger, a line has to add up. So she reads budgets. For 4 months, on evenings and weekends, she reads declassified appropriations documents from the 1960s and 1970s, the ones that were released decades later, with black bars laid across them like bandages. She reads until the language stops looking like language and starts looking like weather. And in a document from 1968, sandwiched between a line item for airfield resurfacing and a line item for the procurement of laboratory glassware, she finds a compartmentalised programme with no explanation attached to it. The line reads, in full, long-range astronomical signal analysis. Underneath it, a code word, Project Echo. She looks it up, expecting an easy answer, and at first she gets one. There was a Project Echo. It was a real and famous thing. In 1960, the Americans launched a satellite that was essentially an enormous silver balloon, a sphere of metallized plastic 100 feet across, inflated in orbit. It had no electronics at all. It was simply a mirror. You bounced a radio signal off it, and it came down somewhere else on the planet, and for a few years it was the most visible object in the night sky after the moon, drifting overhead in a slow, bright arc while people stood in their gardens and pointed. A lovely, hopeful, entirely public piece of engineering. And a perfect place to hide a name, because the funding she is looking at does not belong to a balloon. The balloon program ended in 1969 when the second satellite fell back into the atmosphere and burned. This line item does not end. She follows it forward through the archive, watching it change departments, watching it get folded into larger appropriations, and then quietly reappear as its own line again, watching its code word rotate every few years the way code words are supposed to. 1968, 1975, 1983, 1991, 2004, 2019, unbroken. 58 years of continuous funding for a program whose only public description is 5 words long. Administrations change, parties change. The Cold War ends and a different world begins. Enormous programs with powerful supporters are cancelled every year, killed by budget committees who have never heard of them. Whole weapon systems die. Entire agencies are dissolved. And this quiet little line, 5 words long, never even gets debated. Which means that whatever it is, every incoming administration has been told about it, and every single one of them has decided to keep paying. It takes her another 2 months to find someone willing to talk. His name is Thomas Avery. He is 86 years old, and he lives on the edge of a small town in Virginia, in a house with a workshop out the back. And when she finally reaches him by telephone, he does not sound surprised to hear from her. He sounds like a man who's been expecting a call for a very long time and had begun to think it would not come. She drives out on a Saturday. It takes 4 hours. The last 30 minutes are on roads with no lines painted on them. He makes her coffee. He shows her the workshop, which is full of radio equipment in various states of repair, valves and copper and hand-wound coils, all of it older than she is and all of it working. He was, he tells her, a receiver engineer, not an astronomer. He did not care much about the stars. What he cared about was signal chains, front ends, cryogenic amplifiers, the art of hearing something faint without hearing yourself. He worked at Greenbank. He worked at Arecibo for 2 years. He consulted on installations in 3 other countries. He is exactly the sort of person who would have been useful to a program that needed the same equipment installed in a great many places without anyone comparing notes. She asks him about Project Echo. He does not deny it. That is the first thing that frightens her. He simply nods slowly and turns his cup around on the table and says that he wondered whether that was why she had come. Then he asks her a question of his own. He asks her how much time she thinks a big radio telescope spends actually searching. She starts to answer, and he holds up a hand kindly, the way an old teacher does. Because the answer, he tells her, is not what the public believes. People imagine these instruments sweeping the sky, roaming from star to star like a lighthouse beam. And some of them do, some of the time. But he had access to the pointing logs, the raw operational records of where the dish was actually aimed hour by hour, and there was always a category of observing time that did not appear in any published schedule. Maintenance blocks, calibration windows, engineering tests, hours in the middle of the night allocated to no principal investigator, generating no papers, belonging to nobody. And during those hours, he tells her, the dish was not idle. The dish was pointed. And it was pointed at the same coordinates it had been pointed at the night before, and the night before that, and every night going back further than his own career. Not searching, watching. She asks him if he knows what they were watching. He says no. He says he was never told and never asked because he was young, and the pay was extraordinary, and there was an understanding in that line of work that curiosity was a thing you left in the car park. But he was given instructions, standing instructions, written on a single card, laminated, kept in the control room, replaced when it got worn. He can still recite them. He recites them for her now, in a kitchen in Virginia, with the coffee going cold between them. Never transmit toward the target, never acknowledge an incoming signal, never discuss the coordinates outside this room. She sits with that. Then she says the obvious thing. She says that if you have located an intelligent civilization, the first 2 rules make no sense at all. That every scientist she has ever met would give up 10 years of their life to be the person who answered. That the entire point of the search, the whole purpose of every dish ever built, is contact. And Avery says, well. And then he says the sentence that she will think about every night for the rest of her life. He says because somebody already did. She asks him what he means. He says he does not know what he means. He says that is exactly what he was told, once, by a man who had drunk more than he should have at a retirement dinner in 1981, and that he has spent 40 years not asking a follow-up question, and that he is now 86 years old and has recently concluded that this was cowardice. Then he goes into the back room and comes out with a shoebox. Inside it are pointing logs, photocopies, taken quietly over a period of years, of pages he was never supposed to remove from a building he no longer has access to. Hundreds of them. Timestamps and coordinates, in the neat pencil handwriting of men who have been dead for decades. He pushes the box across the table toward her. He says he's too old to do anything useful with them. He says he would rather they went to someone who could count. And then he says one more thing, almost as an afterthought. As she is standing in the doorway with the box under her arm and the evening coming down over the fields, he says that in all those years, in all those thousands of hours of listening, the equipment was never once configured to record continuously. It was configured to trigger, to sit silent and do nothing and wait for a change. He says you do not build a system like that to find something. You build a system like that to be notified. It takes her the better part of a year to reconstruct what was taken. She cannot recover the missing recordings. Those are gone, sitting in somebody's vault. and no amount of cleverness will bring them back. But she can recover their shadows, and that turns out to be enough. Here is how. Every observing run generates more than one kind of record. The primary data is the sound of the sky, and that is what was removed. But alongside it, almost as an afterthought, instruments log housekeeping information, receiver temperature, total power in the band, automatic gain settings, antenna position. Dozens of small dull numbers recorded once a second, kept forever because they are tiny, and nobody has ever bothered to clean them out. Nobody removed the housekeeping. Why would they? It is meaningless. It is the equivalent of stealing a photograph and leaving behind the exposure settings. Except that when a strong narrow signal enters a receiver, the automatic gain control notices. It pulls back, very slightly, to keep the total power in range. That adjustment is recorded. It does not tell you what the signal said. It tells you that there was one, and how strong it was, and precisely when it started and stopped. She has the fingerprints. She does not have the hands. But fingerprints are enough to count. She writes the code over a summer, and she runs it across 940 gaps and 400,000 hours of housekeeping logs from 22 observatories in 11 countries, and one Thursday afternoon the output finishes, and she plots it, and she has to go and stand outside in the car park for 20 minutes before she can come back in and look at it again. It is not one signal, it is dozens of distinct sources, scattered through that one small region of Cygnus and the depths of sky behind it, at every conceivable distance. Some near, a few hundred light years. Some appallingly far, out past the far side of the galactic core, so distant that the light leaving them was already ancient when the first cells on Earth learned to divide. And every single one of them tells the same story. She finds it first in the oldest and clearest example, a source about 1100 light years away, and once she has seen the shape, she cannot stop seeing it everywhere. The first stage is faint and messy, broadband, weak, untidy leakage across a wide range of frequencies, exactly the kind of thing a civilization produces without meaning to when it starts using radio for its own purposes. Traffic control, broadcasting, radar, the electromagnetic equivalent of the glow a city throws up into the clouds. It builds slowly over decades, and in the record it looks like a room getting gradually warmer. The second stage is faster, much faster. The leakage intensifies, sharpens, organises. New frequency bands light up in sequence, higher and higher, as though someone were climbing a ladder. Modulation grows more complex. Power grows. In one case, she can watch a source triple its output in 19 years, which in the life of a species is an eye blink. She knows what that stage is because we are living in it. That is a civilization discovering what it can do. That is the part where everything accelerates and everyone is optimistic. The third stage is the one that makes her hands cold, because after the acceleration comes something entirely different in character. The messy broadband glow drops away, all of it, quite suddenly. And in its place there appears a single, coherent, extraordinarily powerful narrow-band transmission. Focused, deliberate, aimed outward, repeating on a regular cycle with a clean mathematical structure underneath it. Not leakage, not accident, a beacon. The sound of somebody standing up and saying, "We are here. We are here. Is anybody else there?" She recognises it because she has read the papers proposing exactly this. It is what we ourselves have argued about for 60 years. It is what every optimistic scientist has always assumed a mature civilization would eventually do, once it grew confident enough and coordinated enough and rich enough to build a transmitter that could be heard across the light years. Announcing yourself is the natural graduation. It is what you do when you have decided that the universe is a place worth speaking to. The beacons last, on average, between 4 and 11 years, and then comes the fourth stage. The fourth stage is nothing, not a fade, not a decline, not a slow guttering out over decades as a civilization exhausts itself or loses interest or moves on to some technology we would not recognize. In every case she can measure with any precision, the transition from full transmission to absolute silence happens inside a single observing window, sometimes inside a single hour. One source, at 840 light-years, is transmitting at full power at the beginning of a 6-hour run in 1988. At the end of that run, the sky at those coordinates is empty. Not just the beacon, the broadband glow underneath it, the thin residual hum of an entire technological world, the part that should keep going regardless of whether anyone is running the transmitter, that is gone too. Everything at once. She checks that source for the following 35 years of archive. Nothing. Not one photon out of place. A perfectly ordinary star with nothing whatsoever around it. She goes through them one by one. Dozens of them. She builds a chart, and the chart is the most terrible thing she has ever made because it is beautiful. It is orderly. Every column is the same shape. Emergence, acceleration, announcement, silence, emergence, acceleration, announcement, silence, over and over and over, at different distances, in different eras, among stars that have nothing in common except the direction we happen to see them from. And then she notices the last detail, and it is the detail that turns a tragedy into a mechanism. She measures the interval, not between the civilizations, which are scattered randomly across time as you would expect. She measures the interval within each one, the length of time between the moment a beacon begins and the moment everything stops. It should be random. There is no reason for it to be anything else. Civilizations are not identical. They arise on different worlds, with different histories, different biologies, different appetites for risk. Some would broadcast for a century out of sheer stubbornness. Some would give up after a year. It is not random. The mean is a little over 7 years. The scatter around it is small, very small. So small that she runs the statistics 4 separate ways because she is certain she has made a mistake, and each time the answer comes back the same. Whatever ends these civilizations is not arriving randomly. It is arriving on a schedule, and when she corrects for distance, when she accounts for the fact that a beacon 3,000 light-years away took 3,000 years to reach us, and the news of its death took just as long, the pattern gets even tighter, not looser. Which means the thing that ends them is not travelling from a single fixed place, arriving sooner at nearby targets and later at distant ones. If it were, the interval would stretch with distance. It does not. Wherever they are, they're close to everywhere, or they are not travelling at all. She sits with the chart open on her screen until the automatic lights in the corridor outside go out because nothing has moved in the building for an hour. And she thinks about the number 7. Because 7 years in the life of a species is not a war. A war takes generations. 7 years is not a plague or a famine, or a slow collapse of the kind we like to imagine when we imagine our own ending. 7 years is not even long enough for the survivors to organise. 7 years is a response time. 7 years is how long it takes for something to notice, and decide, and arrive. Let your breathing settle again. We're going somewhere quieter now, and colder. The recording from 1977 comes to her in the least dramatic way imaginable. It arrives in the post, in a padded envelope, with no return address, containing a single archival data cartridge of a format that has not been manufactured since the 1990s. It takes her 3 weeks to find a working drive. She eventually buys one from a man in Ohio, who restores obsolete storage hardware as a hobby, and who charges her $40 and includes a handwritten note wishing her luck with her project. She does not sleep the night the file opens. It is 11 minutes and 40 seconds long, exactly as described in the fragmentary references she has been chasing for 2 years, and the first thing she notices is that it is layered. The outer layer is the carrier, a pure tone, sitting just above the hydrogen line. holding steady with a precision that no natural object achieves. That layer alone would have been enough to make history. Beneath it is a framing layer, a repeating structure that says, in effect, here is where the message begins, and here is where it ends, and here is how you tell the difference between a symbol and a space. It is the same solution we came up with ourselves when we tried to design a message for strangers. It has to be. There are only so many ways to do it. Beneath that is arithmetic, counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, expressed as pulses, so that whoever receives it can establish the alphabet before trying to read the words, then the primes walking upward in their crooked ladder, then the ratio of a circle to its own diameter, expressed to 19 places, which is the universe's way of shaking hands. And beneath all of that, in the deepest and most heavily encoded layer, is the actual content. It is not a description of a world. It is not a picture. It is not a portrait of the senders, or a map, or an invitation, or any of the thousands of beautiful things that people have imagined a first message might contain. It is a table, 2 columns. The first column is a list of positions, coordinates given relative to structures that do not move, the great landmarks of the galaxy that look the same from anywhere. Dozens of entries. She recognises them almost immediately because she's been staring at those same coordinates for 2 years, and they are the sources on her chart. Every civilization she has counted, every emergence, acceleration, announcement, silence. The second column is durations. Each entry gives the length of time between that civilization's first beacon and its last transmission. 4 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 5 years, 7 years, 7 years. It is a ledger. Somebody, somewhere, has been keeping the same record she has, only for very much longer, and with very much better instruments. And at the end of that ledger there is a final section that is not like the others. It is a single position, and it is not in Cygnus. It takes her a night with a star chart and a great deal of careful arithmetic to be certain, and when she is certain, she puts her pen down and goes and sits on the floor of her kitchen with her back against the cupboards, because there is nowhere else to go. The coordinates are ours, not the Earth. She wants to be precise about this later when she writes it all down, because precision is the only comfort left. The coordinates are a rough position for our sun, given to a tolerance that suggests the senders knew our general neighbourhood, but not our exact address. And in the second column, beside it, where the duration should be, there is no number. There is a symbol that appears nowhere else in the message, which the original analysts, 4 decades ago, working with pencils and slide rules and no idea what they were doing, eventually determined meant something like open, or pending, or unresolved. Not yet. After the table, there is one more thing. Short, 9 symbols. It sits apart from everything else, in its own frame, repeated 3 times as though the senders were determined it should not be lost in transmission. The original team took 4 years to render it, and their rendering has never been improved upon, and it is 3 words long. Do not answer. That is the whole message. That is the entire content of the only transmission humanity has ever received from another intelligence in the history of our species. Not a greeting, not a philosophy, not a gift, a list of the dead, a note that we are not on it yet, and 3 words of advice. She reads it perhaps 100 times over the following month, and what she keeps coming back to is not the horror of it, but the kindness. Because whoever sent that did so knowing exactly what it cost them. You cannot warn someone silently. The act of transmission is the act of exposure. Every syllable of that message was a shout in the dark. They knew what happened to those who shout. They had a table of it. They did it anyway. And then, 7 years later, according to the archive she has spent 2 years reconstructing, they stopped. She finds their entry on her own chart eventually, and it is the entry with the shortest duration of them all, 4 years and 2 months. They did not build up slowly. They did not announce themselves gradually, and then get more confident. They lit up all at once at full power, transmitted the same table over and over for 4 years in every direction they could manage, and then went out. They were not announcing themselves. They were spending themselves. The last piece of it she finds in a place she should never have been able to reach, and she reaches it because Thomas Avery, 86 years old and out of patience, makes 2 telephone calls on her behalf, and then dies 4 months later in his sleep, in the house with the workshop out the back, having never once been thanked publicly for anything. She's taken to an observatory that officially closed in 1994. It is in a high place, at the end of a road that is not maintained. The dish is still there, rusting, tilted at a useless angle, with grass growing up through the access ladders and a tree that has taken root in the counterweight housing. It looks like every abandoned thing looks, sad and enormous and slightly embarrassed. The building beside it is not abandoned at all. She notices it before they even get out of the car. The gravel is compacted. The windows have been recently sealed. There is a modern electrical supply running down the hillside on new poles, feeding a facility that has been publicly derelict for 30 years, and which draws, she later calculates, roughly enough power to run a small hospital. They go down, 3 levels, on a staircase built in the 60s, into corridors that smell of concrete dust and dry electrical heat. And then a room. It is not a dramatic room. That is what she remembers most clearly afterward. She had built something operatic in her imagination. A vault. A cathedral of secrets. It is a storage room with a low ceiling and fluorescent lights and shelving units on rails. The sort you find in any large library. The shelves hold recordings. Tape at the far end going back to the beginning. Then optical media. Then drive arrays, humming quietly, temperature controlled, endlessly copying themselves forward as formats change, so that nothing is ever lost to obsolescence. 60 years of the missing hours, every deleted minute from every observatory on Earth, gathered and kept and maintained by people who have quietly handed the responsibility down through 3 generations. And on the far wall there is a map. It is old. It has been added to by many different hands over many decades, in different inks, with the corrections and annotations of people who have all now retired or died. It shows the region of Cygnus and the depths behind it, star by star, and beside each marked position there is a card, and on each card there is a name that means nothing to her, an internal designation, a filing reference. Most of the cards have a line drawn through them, not a cross, not a scribble, a single, careful, ruled line, drawn with a straight edge by someone who took no pleasure in drawing it. Dozens of them, going back decades, each one dated. She walks the length of the wall and reads the dates. 1961, 1966, 1974, 1977, which is the one with the warning behind it, and which somebody has annotated in small letters that she has to lean close to read. 1988, 1995, 2009, 2017, and at the end of the wall, at the very edge, slightly apart from the rest as though it had been added later or perhaps first, there is one more card. It has no line through it. It is not in Cygnus. It is not anywhere near Cygnus. It has been placed on the wall for reasons of bookkeeping rather than geography, and the name written on it is not an internal designation at all. Somebody, at some point, in handwriting that is careful and old-fashioned and slightly cramped, has simply written the word sun. Here is the thing that changes once you have stood in that room. For 60 years, every conversation about the silence of the universe has started from the same assumption. The assumption is that the silence is a problem to be explained, that something must be preventing life from arising, or preventing intelligence from emerging, or preventing civilizations from lasting. We invented a whole vocabulary for it. We called it the Great Filter, and we argued about whether it lay behind us or ahead of us, and either answer was frightening in its own way. But every one of those explanations assumes the same thing about the sky, that it is empty. Stand in front of that wall, and the sky is not empty. The sky is full. It is crowded. It has been crowded the entire time. Life is not rare. Intelligence is not a fluke. Technology is not some improbable lightning strike that happened once in 13 billion years on one blue world in an unremarkable spiral arm. The universe is teeming. The universe is simply quiet. And those are two enormously different things. And the difference between them is the difference between a forest at midday and a forest at midnight. They are not absent. They are not extinct, most of them. They are not refusing to talk to us out of some grand moral principle, waiting patiently for us to mature, watching from a distance with benevolent interest the way we always like to imagine. They are hiding, not from us. We do not matter enough to hide from. We are a chemical accident on a wet rock that has been using radio for about a century, which in galactic terms is not even a full breath. Nobody is hiding from us. They are hiding from the same thing we would be hiding from if we knew. This is where the philosophy comes in, and I want to be careful here because this part is real. This part is not conspiracy. This part is an idea that human beings arrived at entirely on our own, with nothing but logic, sitting in comfortable rooms with no evidence whatsoever. It is called the dark forest hypothesis, and it was popularized in a novel by the Chinese writer Liu Cixin, and it works like this. Imagine you are walking through a forest at night. It is genuinely dark. You cannot see more than a few feet in any direction, and you know, because you can occasionally hear movement, that you are not alone in that forest. There are others moving through the trees. You do not know how many. You do not know where. Now consider your situation from the point of view of pure survival, without any assumptions about anybody's character. You cannot see the others. They cannot see you. Communication between you is desperately slow, because the forest is vast, and any message you send takes years or centuries to arrive, and just as long to be answered. So you can never establish trust in real time. By the time you have exchanged 3 sentences, generations have passed on both sides. The being that answers you is not the being that heard you, and you cannot know their intentions. Not really. You can hope. You can guess. But you cannot know, and worse than that, you cannot know what they assume about you. Even if they are gentle, even if they are the kindest thing that ever evolved, they must consider the possibility that you are not. And you must consider that they are considering it. And they must consider that you are considering that. That regress has no bottom. It goes down forever. And sitting underneath it is one hard fact about technology, which is that it accelerates. A civilization that is harmless today may not be harmless in 500 years, and 500 years is nothing across those distances. The neighbour who is primitive when you first hear them will be your equal by the time your greeting arrives, and might be far beyond you by the time they answer. So you are standing in a dark forest, unable to see, unable to communicate quickly, unable to establish trust, and every other occupant is a stranger who will inevitably become more powerful than they are now. Under those conditions, the mathematics is brutally simple. The only guaranteed safe strategy is to remain silent, and the second safest strategy, the one that removes the last of your uncertainty, is to eliminate anything that reveals itself, not out of malice. That is what people always misunderstand about it. There is no hatred in it. There is no war, no ideology, no grievance. It is nothing more than a rational actor in an environment where the cost of being wrong is total annihilation, and the cost of striking first is very nearly zero. In a forest like that, everyone who survives becomes a hunter, not because they wanted to, because the ones who did not survive to teach anyone otherwise, and so anyone who lights a fire, anyone who calls out, anyone who says, "Here I am," is not making contact. They are giving away their position. The founders of Project Echo reached this conclusion in the middle of the 1960s, decades before anybody wrote a novel about it, and they reached it not from philosophy, but from a table of numbers copied out of a signal they could barely read. They did not need to theorize about whether the forest was dark. They had a ledger of everyone in it who had ever spoken. Now, the obvious question, the one Mercer asks in the room with the wall, Who are they? And the answer, after 60 years, thousands of hours of observation and the resources of every major government on Earth, is that nobody has the faintest idea. Nobody has ever detected a hunter. Not once. Not a ship, not an engine, not a heat signature, not a communication, not a single photon that can be attributed to whatever is doing this. The archive contains no evidence of the predator whatsoever. It contains only the outcomes. 60 years of observing an effect with no observable cause. What they have instead is arithmetic, and the arithmetic is the worst part of the whole story. Because consider what the interval means. 7 years on average from the first beacon to total silence. That number does not vary with distance. A civilization 800 light-years away and a civilization 4,000 light-years away both get roughly 7 years. If something were travelling to them, even at the speed of light itself, which nothing with mass can do, the response time would have to scale with distance. Nearby targets would die quickly, and distant targets would die much later. That is not a subtle effect. It would be enormous. It would be the single most obvious feature of the data. It is not there, which leaves a small number of possibilities, and every one of them is worse than the last. Perhaps the hunters are already everywhere. Perhaps every star system in the galaxy, including ours, contains something small and patient and dormant, placed there long ago, waiting for a particular sound. Not watchers, triggers. In which case the 7 years is not travel time at all. It is decision time. It is how long it takes for something local to confirm what it has heard and receive whatever authorization it requires. Or perhaps they are not travelling in the way we understand travel. There is a note in the archive, written by an analyst in the 1980s, on a page of a report otherwise full of statistics. Someone has written it in the margin, in pen, and then someone else has photocopied the page with the marginal note included, and that photocopy has been kept for 40 years, because whoever kept it understood that the note was the only honest thing in the document. It says that they are not crossing the galaxy. And then, underneath, in the same hand, after what must have been a pause, they are crossing probability. Nobody knows what he meant. He never explained it. He left the program the following year and worked in insurance until he retired. But there is a school of thought inside Project Echo, never written down formally, that believes he was describing something about the structure of the response, that the arrival is not an arrival, that whatever ends these civilizations does not come from anywhere and does not need to travel, because it is not a thing moving through space so much as a condition being applied to it. That is where the science stops and the fear begins. That is the edge of the map, and past it there is nothing but the honest admission that we do not know. And really, for the purposes of this story, it does not matter. Because the practical conclusion is identical regardless of the mechanism, and every government on Earth arrived at it independently, and it fits on a single line. It does not matter what is out there. It only matters that it is listening. Now let me tell you the part of this that hides in public. Because a good conspiracy does not require anybody to lie. A truly good one requires only that everybody keep telling the truth in a slightly narrower way than they used to, and that nobody ever be asked the one question that would make the narrowing visible. Go and look at the way we talk about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, not the way it is portrayed in films, the actual literature, the mission statements, the stated objectives of the major programs, written down in their own words by the scientists themselves. In the early years, from the 1960s through the early 1980s, the language is enormous. It is full of contact and communication and dialogue, and the exchange of knowledge between worlds. Papers are written about what we ought to say. Conferences are held about the linguistic problems of a first conversation. Committees are formed to consider who would speak for Earth, and there are genuine, serious, occasionally heated arguments about whether that person should be a scientist or a diplomat or the Secretary General of the United Nations. The assumption underneath all of it is that finding them is the beginning of something. Then, somewhere in the middle of the 1980s, the vocabulary changes. It happens gradually enough that no individual step looks like anything. Contact becomes detection. communication becomes characterization. The papers about what we should say stop being written and are replaced by papers about verification protocols, about how to confirm a candidate's signal, about how to rule out interference, about the statistical standards required before an announcement could responsibly be made. All of it entirely reasonable, all of it exactly what a maturing science ought to produce. And by the end of that decade, the field has an agreed international protocol for what to do in the event of a confirmed detection, and it is a genuinely public document, and anybody can read it. And Mercer reads it 4 times in a row on the night she finally goes looking. It is very good. It is careful and thoughtful, and it does all the things you would want. It says the discoverer should verify before announcing. It says the information should be shared openly with the world. It says the discovery belongs to all of humanity. And then it comes to the question of replying, and it says that no response should be sent until appropriate international consultations have taken place. That is it. That is the whole of it. A sentence so mild that it slides straight through you, worded like an administrative courtesy, the sort of thing you would write about a press release. No response shall be sent. Not, we will consider carefully what to say. Not, a committee shall draft a reply. Simply, no response, pending consultations that have never been defined, by bodies that have never been created, according to a process that does not exist and has never been drafted in 60 years, despite the protocol being revised repeatedly. There is a mechanism for detecting. There is a mechanism for verifying. There is a mechanism for announcing. There has never at any point been a mechanism for answering. She checks whether anyone has ever noticed this. A few people have. It has been raised politely at conferences. It is generally treated as an interesting bureaucratic oversight, the kind of thing that will surely be tidied up eventually. It has not been tidied up. It will not be, because it is not an oversight. And then there is the matter of the transmissions, because here is the thing that a person only notices if they go looking for it. We have, as a species, deliberately transmitted messages to the stars only a handful of times. You could count them on your fingers. In 60 years of a global scientific enterprise dedicated to finding company in the universe, with hundreds of powerful transmitters available to us, we have chosen to speak up perhaps a dozen times, and most of those were symbolic gestures lasting minutes, aimed at nothing in particular, done for the anniversary of something. Every serious proposal to do it properly, to build a real beacon and hold it steady for decades so that it might actually be found, has died. Every single one. Not by being refused because refusing would require a reason. They simply lose their funding at review, or get reclassified as low priority, or are approved in principle and then never scheduled, or get quietly folded into some other program and never come out again. For 60 years, with the technology entirely within our reach, humanity has consistently and comprehensively declined to shout. And there was exactly one moment when we came close, and it is the moment that Mercer keeps returning to. The 16th of November, 1974, Arecibo. The great dish in the sinkhole freshly upgraded and a ceremony held to mark the occasion, with several hundred guests standing on the platform and among the hills. Frank Drake, the man who first put on the headphones in 1960, wrote a message with the help of Carl Sagan and a handful of others. 1,679 binary digits, arranged so that if you knew anything about prime numbers, you would find the only sensible way to lay them out in a grid, and the grid would resolve into a picture. The picture showed the numbers 1 to 10, the elements that make up life on Earth, the structure of our genetic material, a stick figure of a human being, the population of our planet, a diagram of our solar system with the third world raised up to show which one was ours, and a drawing of the telescope itself, with its size given, so that whoever received it would know exactly what kind of instrument had spoken to them. They aimed it at a globular cluster 25,000 light-years away, and they broadcast for 3 minutes at a power that, at that frequency, briefly made our small planet the brightest object of its kind in this corner of the galaxy. It was, and remains, the most powerful deliberate signal humanity has ever aimed at the sky. The official position on it has always been that it was symbolic, a demonstration of the upgraded equipment. Nobody seriously expected an answer, since any reply could not possibly arrive for 50,000 years, and the cluster will have moved by then anyway. That is all true, and it is also the reason nobody has ever thought to ask what happened afterward. Mercer finds the correspondence in an appendix to a Project Echo review document, and it is not what she expects at all, because it is not calm. It is the only genuinely frantic thing in 60 years of an archive otherwise written in the flattest bureaucratic language imaginable. Somebody, 4 days after the ceremony, sent a memorandum consisting of 2 sentences, the second of which is a single word. The first sentence asks who authorised it. The second sentence is unbelievable. And then there is a year of activity. Monitoring assignments rewritten. Observation schedules reorganised. A standing watch established. Not on the cluster they aimed at, because that was never the concern, but on our own immediate neighbourhood. On the nearby stars. On everything within a few hundred light years. They were not waiting for a reply. They were waiting to see whether anything nearby reacted, and for 8 years nothing did. Then, in 1982, 2 of the sources on the Cygnus chart went dark. Not because of us. That is the point, and it is why she cannot let go of it. The physics is simple and merciless. The light from those systems had been travelling for 1100 and for 2,300 years respectively. Whatever ended them had happened long before Frank Drake was born. Our transmission had absolutely nothing to do with it, and could not have, and everyone in the programme understood that perfectly well. But the timing broke something in the people who were watching. There is a note in the file, written by the director of the programme at the time, and it is short, and Mercer photographs it because she wants to be able to look at it again later and confirm that a person really did write it down. He wrote that it was a coincidence. Then he wrote that it did not feel like one. Then he wrote that this was precisely the problem, that they had spent 15 years building an organisation whose entire purpose was to ensure humanity never gave away its position, and that they had just watched their own government hand out our address at a garden party, and that the only thing standing between us and whatever crossed off those cards was the hope that nobody happened to be listening on a Saturday in November. Within 3 years, the international protocol acquires its sentence about consultation. Within 10, every major transmission proposal in the world begins its long, quiet slide into never happening, and in the 2000s, an understanding forms between governments who cannot agree on anything else. There is no treaty, there is nothing signed. Mercer looks for one, and there is not a scrap of paper anywhere. There does not need to be, because you do not need a treaty to establish that nobody will step off a cliff. You only need everybody to have seen the same drop. Whatever else divides the powerful nations of this planet, and it is a very great deal, they have all independently been shown the same wall with the same cards on it, and the same careful ruled lines, and every one of them without exception has come to the same conclusion and then never mentioned it again. We do not answer, we do not announce, we do not so much as clear our throat, and the reason for it, the reason underneath all 60 years of it, is not that we believe we are alone, it is that we are absolutely certain we are not. And now we come to the last night of the story, and I want you to be very comfortable before we go there, because the rest of it is quiet. It is a Tuesday. There is nothing special about it. Mercer has been formally read into the programme for 11 months by this point, which is its own strange piece of the story, because they did not silence her and they did not threaten her. They gave her a desk. That is how it works, apparently. When somebody assembles the truth on their own, out in the open, with nothing but patience and a script and a shoebox full of photocopies, you do not need to stop them. You only need to give them the rest of it, and let the weight do the work. She has learned by now that the room with the wall is one of 9 such rooms on this planet. She has met people from 4 of them. They are not sinister. They are tired. They are largely academics who came in young, expecting to spend their lives on the greatest discovery in human history, and who instead spend their lives maintaining a filing system and watching stars go out. At 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, her phone makes a sound she has never heard it make. It is not a ringtone. It is the alert, and everyone who works in that building has it configured, and almost none of them have ever heard it either, because it fires roughly once every 8 years. She reads the line on the screen twice. A source has changed state. She's in the car before she's finished putting her coat on. The roads are empty. It takes 50 minutes. When she arrives, there are already 11 people in a room built for 6 and nobody is talking, and somebody has brought in an extra chair from the corridor. On the main display is a source she knows well. She has been watching it for the better part of 2 years. It is roughly 930 light years away, which means everything on that screen actually happened while the last of the great cathedrals was still being finished, and the news has only just now finished its journey. 6 years and 4 months ago, by the clock of the arriving light, that source had begun broadcasting a beacon. She had watched it start. She remembers the day, because it was the only time in her career she has ever felt what she can only describe as grief in advance. There had been nothing to do about it. There was no possible way to warn them. Anything she sent would take 930 years to arrive, and would arrive at an empty world, and would announce to everything in between exactly who had sent it. So they had done what the program has always done. They had written the card, they had pinned it to the wall, and they had waited. At 3 minutes past 2 the beacon stopped, not diminished, not interrupted. It is present in one file and absent in the next, and the 2 files are 8 seconds apart. And underneath it, where there had been the faint, warm, untidy electromagnetic murmur of an inhabited world, there is now the ordinary spectrum of a star with nothing around it at all. 6 years and 4 months. Almost exactly on the average, comfortably within the scatter. Nobody in the room says anything for a while. Then a man near the door takes a card out of a small box that lives on a shelf for this purpose, and a straight edge, and a pen, and he goes out to the wall and draws the line and writes the date and comes back in. That, it turns out, is the whole of the ceremony. There is not anything else to do. And then, at 4 hours and 6 minutes, while she's still sitting in that room with a cup of something she has not drunk, the receivers catch something else. It is narrow. Extremely narrow. Narrower than anything in the archive, so tightly focused that they are almost certainly detecting only the ragged outer edge of it. The spill at the margin of a beam that was never intended to touch us. It is not aimed at Earth. That is established within the hour, and it is the only piece of good news in the entire night. The geometry is unambiguous. Whatever this is, it is passing through our solar system on its way to somewhere else, in the same sense that a car passes a house. It is very short, it is heavily structured, and it uses the same framing convention as the message from 1977, which means it can be read, and which also means something that nobody in that room is willing to say aloud, which is that both messages were written by things that use the same protocol. It takes 9 days to decode, and when it is done, it is 2 words long. Target acquired. That is all. 2 words riding through our solar system at the speed of light on their way to somewhere we cannot determine, from somewhere we cannot locate, referring to something we cannot identify, in a language we should not be able to read. The receivers logged it in passing, the way a microphone in an empty room logs a conversation happening out in the street. And that, in the end, is when Mercer finally understands what Project Echo actually is. Because she had assumed, all this time, that she was looking at a cover-up, a secret kept for its own sake, the way secrets usually are. She had assumed that somewhere at the top of it, there was a policy decision about public panic, or an intelligence advantage, or a religious concern, or all the usual reasons that things get buried. It is none of that. Consider what the program actually does. It does not search. It does not attempt contact. It has never sent a single transmission in its entire history. It does not study the hunters, because there is nothing to study. It does not build defences, because nobody has the first idea what a defence would look like. It watches other civilizations announce themselves, and it measures how long they last, and it writes the number down. That is the entire function. 60 years, 9 facilities, billions of dollars, 3 generations of careers to maintain a table of intervals. And a table of intervals has exactly one use. It is an estimate. Somewhere in a document she's not permitted to photograph, there is a figure, updated annually, with a confidence range around it. It is the current best estimate of how long a civilization has between the moment it is noticed and the moment it is finished. They were never trying to find anybody. They were trying to find out how much time we would have. Weeks later, and this part is quiet and boring and almost entirely invisible, which is why nobody notices it. A number of things happen around the world at approximately the same time. Several high-powered planetary radars are taken offline for scheduled maintenance. A handful of deep space communication facilities reduce their maximum transmission power. 2 military over-the-horizon radar installations are decommissioned ahead of schedule and described in the announcements as legacy systems. A satellite constellation delays a set of upgrades. A large observatory cancels a transmission experiment that had been on its schedule for 4 years, citing costs. Each of these is separately reported, in trade publications, in the back pages, in the sections nobody reads. Each has a perfectly ordinary explanation attached to it. Budget, maintenance, modernization, efficiency. None of them are connected in any published account, and in 9 facilities on 4 continents, an instruction is distributed, and it has no explanation attached to it either, and it is 1 sentence long. Reduce humanity's electromagnetic signature. The code name on the header is the same one that has been on that document, unchanged since 1968. Dark Forest. So, let me leave you with the shape of it, and then let you go to sleep. For as long as any of us have been alive, people have believed that governments were hiding something about life beyond this world, that there was a body in a hangar, that there was a craft in a desert, that somewhere there was a photograph or a corpse or a recording, and that the secret being kept was the secret of company, that we are not alone, and that they will not tell us. According to this conspiracy, that is very nearly right, and it is wrong in the one way that matters. They are not hiding proof that intelligent life exists. They are hiding proof of what happens to it. Dozens of times in one small patch of sky, in the fraction of the galaxy we have been able to examine, someone has climbed out of their own long history and looked up, and built something extraordinary and used it to say the bravest sentence any species can say. We are here. And then, a few years later, in every single case, without exception, without a struggle, without so much as a distress call, nothing, again and again and again. We spent a century imagining that our survival would depend on our cleverness, on engines and shields and weapons and the sheer stubborn ingenuity that got us off the ground in the first place. We wrote 1,000 stories about the day we would meet them, and in almost all of those stories the meeting is the beginning of something. But in this version of the story, our greatest advantage was never anything we built. It was that nobody has looked our way yet. It was that we are small and young and faint, and so far, so very far, entirely unremarkable. History will remember the search for extraterrestrial intelligence as humanity's attempt to answer the largest question anyone has ever asked. According to the conspiracy, we answered it a long time ago on a cold night in 1977 in a valley with no streetlights, and the only reason we're still here is that we pretended we never heard it. There is a kind of silence that does not belong to the natural world. You have heard natural silence, the quiet of a forest at 3 a.m, the breathless pause between thunderclaps, the stillness of snowfall in an empty field. Natural silence has a texture to it. It has biological residue, a distant owl, the creak of a tree branch adjusting to cold air, the whisper of wind moving through grass. Natural silence is never total, because life does not permit totality. Life always inserts itself, always adds its small signatures to the ambient record of a living planet. The silence around our Chuleta Mesa is different. It is the kind of silence that you notice after you've been standing in it for several minutes, the kind that registers not in your ears but somewhere in the older architecture of your nervous system, in the part of you that evolved to identify environments where the normal rules of the world had been suspended. Animals notice this kind of silence before humans do. Dogs stop at certain distances from the mesa and will not proceed. Birds alter their flight paths. The cattle that used to graze in the lower pastures north of Dulce showed a behavioural avoidance of specific areas near the mesa's base that the ranchers who watched them noticed and remarked upon to anyone who would listen, long before anyone was paying close attention to what the cattle themselves were being subjected to. The town of Dulce, New Mexico, sits at an elevation of roughly 6,900 feet on the Colorado Plateau, nestled against the southern slopes of the Jicarilla Mountains within the boundaries of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. The population has hovered around 2,000 for most of the past half-century, the kind of number that produces a community small enough to be intimate and large enough to have witnessed things collectively, to have generated a shared memory of events that the wider world was never told about. The main road through town is paved. The surrounding roads diminish quickly from paved to gravel to dirt to track to something that is only navigable by someone who already knows where they're going. The mesa rises to the north of town like a geological sovereign, broad-shouldered and permanent, its layered sandstone face reading the accumulated history of 200 million years of planetary time, with an indifference to human presence that feels, if you spend enough time looking at it, almost deliberate. This is the place where the story begins. Not because stories need a place. Stories need only people and events, and the willingness to follow truth wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that every institutional voice in the room is instructing you not to go. But this particular story is inseparable from this particular geography, from the specific combination of remoteness and geology and federal land status and historical accident that made this mesa, this town, this stretch of high desert in northern New Mexico the location that someone or something chose for purposes that 50 years of investigation have not fully illuminated, and that official silence has consistently and deliberately refused to examine. What happened in Dulce, or what the evidence suggests happened, or what the people who were there and the people who came after them, and the people who died before they could finish telling what they knew, all agree, in their separate and uncollaborated ways, happened, is one of the most extensively documented and deliberately suppressed stories in the modern history of the American Southwest. It involves cattle and blood and precision cuts made by instruments that leave no trace of their origin. It involves nuclear detonations and geological surveys and the creative bureaucratic architecture of programs that do not appear in any public budget. It involves a man who built underground structures for the United States government and who spent the final year of his life telling anyone who would listen exactly what he had found in the dark, and who was dead at 44 under circumstances that a rubber catheter and a missing medications bottle and a ransacked filing cabinet made very difficult to accept as self-inflicted. It involves the question of what is beneath the mesa, and it involves the growing, deepening, increasingly difficult to dismiss suspicion that whatever is beneath the mesa is not only still there, but has never stopped operating. The story does not start with conspiracy, it starts with livestock. The summer of 1975 arrived in the high desert of northern New Mexico the way it always does, with a shift in the quality of light that happens almost overnight. a deepening and intensifying of the gold and amber tones in the landscape that announces the shift from the cool clarity of spring into the particular fullness of high-altitude summer. The ranchers of the Dulce area had been working their land for generations in some cases. They knew the rhythms of the desert the way you only know something when your livelihood depends on reading it correctly. They knew what a healthy herd looked like. They knew the way cattle behaved when they were stressed. They knew, without having to think about it, every predator that shared their range: coyote, mountain lion, bear. And they knew precisely what each predator did to the animals it killed. None of them had ever seen anything like what they began finding in the summer of 1975, and what continued to appear with a regularity that transformed initial shock into a sustained, grinding dread through 1976 and beyond. The animals were dead. That part was conventional enough. Cattle die. They die from illness, from predator attacks, from exposure, from any number of causes that a rancher factors into the annual arithmetic of a working operation. But the manner of death in these cases was not any cause that any rancher in the area had ever encountered. The animals showed no signs of distress prior to death. No running, no defensive injury, no evidence that they had been chased or attacked in any way that left the kinds of physical evidence that a pursuit and kill event invariably produces. They simply appeared, in the morning hours when ranchers made their checks, in the places where the night had left them with specific parts removed, not torn, not chewed, not broken, removed, with a precision that transformed the carcass from the site of an animal's death into something that resembled the result of a surgical procedure conducted under controlled conditions by someone with both an extensive knowledge of bovine anatomy and access to instruments capable of making incisions that left edges so clean, so perfectly bounded, so entirely free of the ragged tissue trauma that any conventional cutting instrument produces, that the veterinary professionals who examined them were, in some cases, visibly unsettled. An ear, removed from the base of the skull with a single continuous cut that followed the exact boundary of the auricular cartilage. The tongue, extracted from the oral cavity through an opening that had been made in the underside of the jaw, reaching to a depth that would have required either very long instruments or the disassembly of the jaw structure, neither of which had occurred. The jaw was intact, the opening was small and precise, and the tongue was simply gone, removed as cleanly as if it had been placed on a surgical tray. The eyes, in most cases. The genitals, in virtually all cases. In some animals, organs that would have required incisions through the body wall, the stomach, the heart, sections of intestine, had been removed through openings that did not tear the surrounding muscle or disturb the adjacent tissue in any way that was consistent with manual extraction. In cases where laboratory analysis was possible, the cut edges showed evidence of heat treatment, a cauterization effect that sealed the wound even as it was made, as though the instrument that created the opening was simultaneously cutting and closing, operating at a speed or with a technology that prevented the bleeding that any cut to living tissue, or recently living tissue, invariably produces. And then there was the blood, the absence specifically of blood, not reduced blood, not blood that had pooled and drained away, no blood. On the animal, at the site of the wounds, on the ground for a radius that investigators searched carefully and repeatedly. A 2-year-old heifer contains approximately 12 gallons of blood. Every one of those gallons was missing from the scene, missing not in the sense that it had drained into the soil. Ground soaks blood in ways that leave evidence, discoloration, thickening, changes in the surrounding vegetation and insect activity, but missing in the sense that it had been removed, taken, as neatly and completely as the organs. Gabe Valdez was the man who had to figure out what to make of all this. He was a New Mexico state police officer assigned to the Dulce area, a practical man in a practical job in a practical part of the world, where the most common call was a traffic incident or a domestic dispute or a boundary conflict between ranchers, the ordinary inventory of rural law enforcement. When the first mutilation reports came to his desk in the summer of 1975, he treated them as he treated everything, as problems to be worked through methodically, with evidence at the centre and speculation at the margins. He drove out to the ranches. He photographed the carcasses in detail, building a visual record that would eventually run to hundreds of images. He collected tissue samples and sent them to veterinary laboratories at the state university. He documented the perimeter of each site, looking for tracks, for physical evidence of how the animals had been approached, for anything that might indicate the method of death and the method of tissue removal. He interviewed every rancher who made a report, and then he interviewed their neighbours, and then he interviewed the neighbours' neighbours, building the widest possible net of information around the events. What came back from the laboratories confirmed what the ranchers had already known from visual inspection. The cuts were not made by animal teeth or claws or any conventional blade. The precision was extraordinary. The heat treatment at the wound edges was real and measurable. The absence of blood was not an artifact of how the samples had been collected or processed. It was a genuine characteristic of the carcasses. And the insect activity, which forensic entomologists would use in subsequent analyses of similar events across the American West, was anomalous in a specific and meaningful way. Flies and beetles that would ordinarily colonize a fresh carcass within hours were, at these sites, absent or dramatically reduced in number, as though something about the condition of the animals was rendering them unattractive as a substrate for insect activity, which required some property of the tissue that no conventional explanation adequately accounted for. The tracks that Valdez found near several of the carcasses have remained among the most discussed physical evidence in the entire Dulce file. They were not animal tracks. They were not human footprints. They were impressions in the soil that had a regularity of spacing and a consistency of depth, and a geometry that Valdez, who had worked enough crime scenes to be able to read physical evidence with practiced eyes, could not reconcile with anything biological. The impressions were approximately circular, roughly 8 to 10 inches in diameter, sunk to a uniform depth of about an inch regardless of the varying softness of the surrounding soil, and spaced with a mechanical consistency, the same distance apart in the same geometric relationship site after site, not the variable pressure-dependent spacing of an animal gait, not the organic irregularity of human footsteps on uneven terrain. Something else. Something that moved with a uniformity of applied force and spatial distribution that suggested not legs but landing pads, not walking but touching down and lifting off, repeatedly, with the precision of a mechanism rather than the variability of a biological limb. Then there were the objects. In the case files that Valdez maintained with a thoroughness that exceeded what his posting required of him, he was not under any institutional pressure to pursue these investigations as deeply as he did. The pressure he felt was internal, the pressure of a person who has looked at something he does not understand and cannot let it go. There are references to physical artifacts found near some of the mutilation sites. He described them as mask-like in shape, fabricated from a material he could not identify, and bearing no markings or features that gave any indication of their origin or purpose. These objects disappeared from the evidence record before they could be subjected to the kind of laboratory analysis that might have produced meaningful data. The chain of custody, in at least 2 cases, simply ends. The objects were logged, transferred to a law enforcement facility for storage, and then, when subsequent requests were made for them, were reported as either missing or never having arrived. This kind of evidence disappearance, which researchers would document repeatedly across multiple categories of physical evidence connected to the Dulce investigation, does not happen by accident. Physical evidence logged and transferred through official channels does not simply cease to exist unless someone with the authority and the motive to remove it has done so. The helicopters were perhaps the element that Valdez found most disturbing in his years of investigation, because unlike the wound patterns and the missing blood and the enigmatic tracks, helicopters were human technology, and their persistent appearance in the windows of time surrounding the mutilation events implied a human role in whatever was occurring. They were not commercial aircraft. They were not the agricultural spraying operations that occasionally work the area. They were unmarked, dark-coloured rotary wing aircraft that flew at night without lights, at altitudes that kept them below standard radar coverage. along routes that Valdez began to map after tracking enough sightings from enough witnesses over enough months to start seeing the patterns in their behaviour. The patterns were not random. The flight corridors, when plotted on a map of the region, converged on a specific area, the land around and above Archuleta Mesa. Not every flight. Not in a way that was so obvious a casual observer would have noticed it, without the accumulated mapping that Valdez had done, but with a statistical consistency that, when Valdez looked at his maps in the evenings after his official duties were done, made the back of his neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The helicopters came from the mesa, or they went to the mesa, or they orbited the mesa in patterns that suggested observation rather than transit, and they appeared again and again in the nights immediately before or after mornings when ranchers would find that the surgery had been conducted on another of their animals. Valdez reported all of this. He reported it to his superiors at the New Mexico State Police. He reported it to the FBI office that eventually, under congressional pressure in the late 1970s, opened a nominal investigation into the cattle mutilation phenomenon. He reported it to researchers and journalists who came to Dulce because the story had begun to seep into the wider cultural conversation through the kinds of channels that official suppression cannot fully close: local newspapers, regional radio, the word-of-mouth networks of rural communities who tell each other what is happening, because they do not have the luxury of institutional authority to tell them it is not important. The FBI's investigation, conducted between 1979 and 1980 under the direction of Special Agent Ken Rommel, produced a report of some length and essentially no substance. The report attributed the mutilations to natural predator activity in carrion scavengers, and to what it characterised as the overwrought imaginations of ranchers unfamiliar with the normal processes of animal decomposition. Gabe Valdez, who by the time the report was released had documented hundreds of incidents and accumulated a body of physical and testimonial evidence that would have been considered significant in any honest investigative context, received this conclusion with the degree of contained fury that those who knew him described as one of the more restrained reactions a man could have to being told, in official language, that everything he had carefully documented had not actually happened. He continued investigating on his own time. He continued until the end of his life. He died in 2010, still asking questions that no official body had ever genuinely tried to answer. To understand why Gabe Valdez's questions were never answered, you have to understand the geography of secrecy that surrounded the place where he was asking them. Northern New Mexico in the 1970s was not simply a remote stretch of high desert. It was the deep operational hinterland of the most extensive complex of classified defense and nuclear research facilities in the world. Within a radius of roughly 150 miles from Dulce, you had Los Alamos National Laboratory, which had been the birthplace of the atomic bomb and remained the most significant nuclear weapons research facility in the United States. You had Sandia National Laboratories, which handled the engineering and systems integration of the nuclear weapons program. You had Kirtland Air Force Base, which maintained nuclear weapons storage and served as a hub for classified aerospace programs. You had White Sands Missile Range, where generations of American weapon systems had been tested in the isolation of the Chihuahuan Desert. You had Holloman Air Force Base. You had a web of smaller facilities and monitoring stations and research outposts that existed in the classified bureaucratic ecosystem that surrounded the public institutions like the unseen portion of an iceberg. This geography of secrecy had specific practical consequences for anyone attempting to investigate unusual phenomena in the region. The classification infrastructure of the national laboratories extended well beyond their physical boundaries. Personnel who worked at Los Alamos lived in the surrounding communities and were bound by security agreements that, in some cases, covered not just their work but their observations and communications more broadly. The culture of institutional silence that the nuclear program had cultivated over decades, a culture in which not asking about things you were not authorized to know was as important as not telling things you were authorized to know, permeated the social fabric of northern New Mexico in ways that were subtle and pervasive and largely invisible to anyone who had not grown up inside it. when strange things happened in this environment, the default response of the people most likely to have relevant knowledge was not to tell. It was to say nothing, and to maintain that nothing with the practiced ease of people for whom institutional silence was not an unusual burden, but a lifetime habit. Into this environment, something had been added in December of 1967 that the public record acknowledges and the conspiracy framework interprets in a way that is either paranoid or incisive, depending on your starting assumptions. Project Gas Buggy was real. Every element of its official description is documentable. It was part of the Plowshare Program, a genuine initiative of the United States Atomic Energy Commission that ran from 1958 to 1973, with the stated goal of finding industrial applications for nuclear explosives. The program detonated 27 nuclear devices in total in locations across the American West, for purposes that range from the ambitious to the absurd: harbour excavation in Alaska, canal construction in Panama, natural gas stimulation in Colorado and New Mexico. Project Gas Buggy was the natural gas stimulation experiment, conducted in partnership with the El Paso Natural Gas Company at a site in the Carson National Forest in Rio Arriba County, New Mexico, approximately 30 miles southwest of Dulce, on December 10th, 1967, at 10 o'clock in the morning. A 29-kiloton nuclear device was detonated at a depth of 4,240 feet below the surface. The explosion fractured the surrounding rock formation, releasing natural gas trapped within it. The gas, when subsequently tested, was found to contain tritium and other radioactive isotopes at levels that made commercial use impractical. The project was evaluated as a partial technical success and an economic failure. The Plowshare Program continued for a few more years with other experiments before being terminated in the early 1970s. That is what the public record says. Now consider what the public record does not say, and what the geography and geology of the region make it reasonable to ask. A 29-kiloton nuclear detonation at 4,000 feet creates a pressure wave that travels outward through the surrounding rock in every direction simultaneously. The characteristics of that pressure wave as it moves, its amplitude, its frequency, its interaction with the specific formations it encounters, are functions of the geological structure through which it is propagating. In a region as geologically complex as northern New Mexico, with its ancient volcanic intrusions and its extensive limestone formations, and its well-documented networks of natural cave systems and subsurface voids, the propagation of that pressure wave is not a simple radiating sphere of uniform energy. It is a complex three-dimensional interaction between the wave and the geological structure, and it produces, in the rock through which it passes, a record of that structure, a seismic tomography in effect of everything between the blast point and wherever the wave's energy finally dissipates. The Atomic Energy Commission would have known this. The geophysicists working on Project Gas Buggy would have known this. The seismic monitoring equipment deployed around the blast site to study the explosion's effects would have recorded in considerable detail exactly how the pressure wave interacted with the surrounding geology, which means it would have produced, as a byproduct of the natural gas stimulation experiment, an extremely detailed map of the subsurface geological structure of a region that included the area beneath Archuleta Mesa. Some of this seismic data is publicly available. Some of it remains classified. The classification of seismic data from a natural gas stimulation experiment conducted in 1967 has never been explained in terms that connect to any specific national security concern related to natural gas. The explanation most commonly offered, when any explanation is offered at all, is that the data contains information about nuclear device design that could be exploited by foreign powers, a rationale that has been used to justify the classification of an enormous variety of Plowshare Program data, and that may in some cases be genuine, and in others may be the bureaucratic equivalent of a closed door with a sign on it that says nothing to see here. The conspiracy interpretation does not require that Project Gas Buggy was secretly intended to excavate an underground base. That would be a reach beyond what the evidence supports. What it requires is something more modest and more plausible. that the geological survey data generated by Project Gasbuggy gave certain people within the classified defence establishment a detailed and actionable picture of the subsurface terrain beneath Archuleta Mesa, and that this picture informed decisions that were made in the subsequent decade about what could be built beneath that mesa, and how and to what depth, and with what connection to the natural geological features already present. The natural features already present were extensive. The Archuleta Mesa sits atop a geological formation that geologists have long recognised as containing significant natural cave systems. The limestone and sandstone strata of the Colorado Plateau in this region are riddled with solution caves, fracture caves, and collapse features that create natural underground spaces of widely varying sizes. Some of these spaces are known and mapped. Some have been entered by cavers and documented in the speleological record. Some almost certainly remain undetected by any systematic survey, existing in darkness and silence at depths where the weight of the rock above them is the only witness to their presence. Natural cave systems of the right scale, in the right geological context with the right access points, represent a significant engineering advantage to anyone planning an underground installation. You do not need to remove all the rock yourself. You need to identify what the rock has already removed for you over millions of years of geological time, and then connect those spaces, reinforce them where necessary, and build within the framework that nature has already provided. The construction footprint is smaller. The excavated material that needs to be disposed of is less. The acoustic and seismic signature of the construction is reduced, and the resulting facility is more naturally adapted to the underground environment than anything built entirely from scratch, because it sits within a structure that has already proven its stability over timescales that no human construction project can match. If the seismic data from Project Gasbuggy showed what the conspiracy framework suggests it showed, a network of natural subsurface spaces beneath Archuleta Mesa of significant extent and appropriate depth, then the subsequent appearance of industrial drilling equipment near the mesa in the mid-1970s, which multiple residents of the Dulce area reported seeing, and which no public works project explained, begins to look less like an anomaly and more like a logical next step. But before we go underground, we need to go back even further. We need to go back to 1954, because the story of what is allegedly beneath Archuleta Mesa cannot be told without the story of how it allegedly came to be there, and that story begins not in New Mexico, but in California, on a February evening when the President of the United States was somewhere he was not officially supposed to be, doing something he was not officially supposed to be doing. Dwight David Eisenhower was 53 days into his second year as president when he disappeared on the evening of February 20th, 1954. He was vacationing at the Smoke Tree Ranch in Palm Springs, California, taking a brief respite from the machinery of the presidency in the way that commanders-in-chief were still permitted to do before the relentless media scrutiny of later decades made genuine privacy essentially impossible. The White House press corps, stationed nearby as they always were, noticed his absence from the public schedule and began making inquiries. The response from the White House press office was a story about a dental emergency, a cap lost from a tooth, an urgent visit to a local dentist, nothing to be concerned about. A dentist was subsequently produced to confirm that the president had been his patient that evening. The dental story was plausible. It was the kind of story that satisfied the immediate need for an explanation without inviting further inquiry, because dental emergencies are personal and mildly embarrassing, and nobody looks too hard at a story that contains those properties. The reporters accepted it. The story was printed. And for years that is where it sat, in the flat, mundane category of minor presidential trivia. It did not stay there. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, a series of individuals who claimed knowledge of the Eisenhower administration's classified activities began telling a different story about the evening of February 20th, 1954. Not a dental appointment, a meeting. At either Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, about 2 hours by air from Palm Springs, or at Edwards Air Force Base in California, which was significantly closer and more logistically convenient for a brief, unannounced departure, Eisenhower allegedly met with representatives of an extraterrestrial civilization. This claim exists in a space that is, from an evidentiary standpoint, extraordinarily difficult to evaluate. The people who have made it most directly include individuals who occupied positions within the intelligence and military establishment of the relevant period, positions that gave them both the theoretical access to such information and the institutional motivation to keep it secret until a point in their lives when the cost of continued silence became greater than the cost of disclosure. The corroboration between independent accounts is more substantial than dismissers of the claim typically acknowledge. The specific details that multiple sources have provided, the location, the date, the general nature of the alleged communication, the specific terms that were discussed, overlap in ways that are more consistent with shared experience than with shared fabrication. What is said to have been discussed and agreed upon at this alleged meeting has shaped, in the conspiracy framework, everything that followed. The entities that Eisenhower allegedly met with had been present in the skies over North America with increasing frequency since at least the late 1940s, when the military began tracking incursions that could not be explained by any known aircraft from any known nation. The frequency and the operational characteristics of these incursions suggested a surveillance mission, a systematic mapping of the human world by observers who were interested in it in ways that were methodical and patient and not immediately threatening but also not comforting. They had been watching for a while, and by February of 1954 they were apparently ready to speak. The agreement that allegedly emerged from these communications, if the accounts of the individuals who claim knowledge of it are to be credited, was transactional in the way that all agreements between parties with asymmetric power are transactional. The extraterrestrials would share certain technologies that, in the context of the 1950s, represented capabilities so far in advance of existing human science that even limited access to the underlying principles could accelerate American military and industrial development by decades. In exchange, the extraterrestrials would be permitted to conduct certain activities on American soil and within American territory that they considered necessary for their own purposes. Chief among these activities, the acquisition of biological samples from human beings and from the animals that human beings used for food. A biological survey, in essence, of the organisms of the North American continent, conducted without public knowledge or consent, but within a framework of government awareness that transformed what might otherwise have been considered an invasion into something that could be filed, in the bureaucratic language of the national security state, as an authorized program. The Dulce area was selected for the joint operations enabled by this agreement, for reasons that, examined in retrospect, have a certain cold logic. The population density in the surrounding region was among the lowest in the continental United States, meaning that unusual activity was less likely to be observed and reported. The land status, a combination of Jicarilla Apache Reservation land and adjacent federal land, created a bureaucratic environment in which civilian oversight was minimal and jurisdictionally complex. The geology was suitable for deep underground construction in ways that the Project Gas Buggy survey had presumably confirmed, and the proximity to the existing classified research infrastructure of the New Mexico Defense Complex meant that personnel could be transferred into and out of the program through institutional channels that were already opaque to public scrutiny, without creating the kind of anomalous paper trail that a completely isolated program would generate. The construction of the alleged facility, by accounts that began circulating in the UFO research community in the 1980s, took place over a period of years in the 1960s and 1970s, using a combination of conventional tunnel boring technology and techniques that the human engineers involved described as being significantly beyond anything available in the public domain. Methods of rock removal and cavity stabilization that operated at speeds and with a precision that the engineering teams found difficult to explain in terms of any technology they had been trained on. The construction proceeded in phases, deepening over time, expanding laterally as the natural cave systems were incorporated into the artificial structure. until the installation reached the configuration that the accounts describe: 7 discrete levels separated by significant vertical distances, connected by shafts and passages that served both as access routes and as the conduits for the ventilation and power distribution systems that made human habitation at that depth survivable. The first 2 levels nearest the surface were dedicated to the security and surveillance apparatus that was the installation's most visible feature from the perspective of the human personnel who worked there. This was where the monitoring systems resided, the cameras and sensors and communication intercept equipment that maintained the facility's awareness of the surface world above it and the approaches to the few access points that connected it to the surface. The personnel at these levels were drawn from the intelligence community rather than the scientific community. Security professionals whose job was to ensure that the installation remained invisible and that anyone who came too close to it, geographically or informationally, was identified and managed before they could constitute a threat to operational security. Below the security levels were the administrative and human research spaces, the laboratories and offices where the human scientists who worked in the installation conducted the overt portions of their programs. These programs, in their official descriptions within the classified bureaucratic structure that surrounded the installation, were extensions of the legitimate defense research being conducted at Los Alamos and Sandia. Materials science, biomedical research, advanced computing. The unclassified face of classified things, the description that could be passed to the relatively small number of officials with budget oversight authority, who needed to be satisfied that the program's enormous costs were producing commensurate value. What was actually happening at the middle levels of the installation was something that the official descriptions did not capture, and that the human researchers who worked there have described in the accounts that have filtered out through the decades since, with a combination of scientific excitement and moral vertigo that suggests people who were doing things they found genuinely extraordinary and genuinely troubling in approximately equal measure. Genetic research was the core discipline, but genetic research of a kind that bore only a distant family resemblance to what was being published in the scientific literature of the same period. The tools and techniques available at the installation, by the accounts of those who worked there, were generations ahead of anything in the public domain, and they enabled experiments that the public scientific community would not acquire the capability to contemplate for decades. The hybridization research, the attempt to combine genetic material from human and non-human sources in configurations that produced viable biological results, is the element of the alleged program that generates the most visceral response in anyone who encounters it, and it is also the element most resistant to objective evaluation, because the emotional weight of the claim tends to overwhelm the evidentiary framework within which it is supposed to be assessed. We will try to describe it as clearly as possible, and as close to the language of those who claim to have witnessed it as we can manage. The program, by these accounts, was not attempting to create monsters, it was attempting to understand life, the deep biological logic that underlies the enormous variety of living forms on this planet and presumably on others. The extraterrestrial participants in the joint program had a biological understanding that exceeded human science not just in its technical specifics, but in its fundamental framework. They understood genetics not as a code to be read, but as a language to be spoken, not as a fixed architecture to be mapped, but as a dynamic system to be engaged. And the experimental program at the middle levels of the installation was, in their view, a basic science project, an exploration of what was possible when the constraints that separate species in nature, the reproductive isolation that keeps genetic lineages separate over evolutionary time, were systematically removed. What was produced in the course of this exploration is described with a reluctance and a careful vagueness in the accounts of those who claim to have seen it, a quality of language that suggests people protecting themselves from the full weight of what they remember. Biological entities is the most common formulation. Not animals, not humans. Entities that occupied a category that human biology had not previously needed a word for, because nothing like them had existed in the natural world, and the things that human mythology had imagined in that conceptual space. Chimeras, hybrids, the creatures that lived at the edges of ancient maps, were pale and inaccurate sketches of something that was more deeply strange than imagination had managed to reach. Level 6 in the accounts was dedicated to the storage of biological materials in cryogenic conditions, genetic samples, embryonic materials, specimens of the entities produced by the hybridization program, preserved at temperatures where biological time essentially stopped, waiting for purposes that the storage protocols did not always specify clearly. The scale of the materials stored at this level, if the accounts are accurate, represented decades of accumulated biological research and suggested a program with a timescale and a scope of ambition that exceeded anything that could be attributed to a short-term military research initiative. This was not a program designed to produce a specific result and then be concluded. This was a program designed to continue indefinitely, to build a body of knowledge and biological material that had a value extending far beyond the immediate operational context of any particular treaty or political administration. And then there is Level 7. The people who claim to have been to Level 7, or who claim to have received reliable accounts from those who were, describe it with a consistency that is the most disturbing thing about the entire Dulce narrative. Not consistency in the specific details. Details vary in the way that details always vary when multiple people describe the same thing from different positions and at different times, but consistency in the emotional register of the description. Across multiple independent accounts, spanning more than 3 decades of testimony, the description of the lowest level of the alleged installation carries the same quality. A flat, careful, deliberately controlled language, the language of people who are managing a genuine fear that has not diminished with time. Not the excited language of someone who has seen something wonderful. Not the performed language of someone constructing a narrative for effect. The language of people describing as accurately as they can something that frightened them profoundly and that they have never found a way to fully integrate into any framework that makes it less frightening. The entities at Level 7, by these accounts, were not the same as the extraterrestrial participants in the joint research program at the upper levels. Those entities, the ones who had allegedly negotiated the treaty, who worked alongside human scientists in the research levels, who communicated through the AI translation systems that the program had developed, were described with a certain clinical respect as beings whose intelligence was evident and whose intentions were at least comprehensible even when they were not reassuring. The beings at Level 7 were different. They were the products of the program rather than its architects, and the decades of biological experimentation that had produced them had created something that existed at the far edge of what the category of life could accommodate. They moved in the darkness of the 7th level, in ways that the monitoring systems could track, but that human observers could not comfortably watch. They registered as biological by every measure: heat, respiration, metabolic activity. But the behavioural data was wrong in ways that were not easy to articulate and were not easy to stop thinking about. Their relationship to the human personnel who occasionally had reason to access that level was not the relationship of an animal to a human, which is familiar even when it is dangerous, and it was not the relationship of one person to another, which is familiar in a completely different way. It was something that did not have a name, and that the people who experienced it described afterward with the particular disorientation of someone who has encountered a category of experience that their conceptual framework was not built to process. We cannot take you there. We cannot show you what the monitoring cameras allegedly recorded. We can only tell you that the people who claim to have seen those recordings have never, subsequently, been willing to describe them in detail, and have never, in the accounts that have filtered out, found a language adequate to what they witnessed. This is the environment that Philipp Schneider claims to have entered in August of 1979, and from which he claims to have barely emerged alive. Philipp Schneider was not, by his own account, a senior figure in the classified program. He was an engineer, a geological and structural engineer with a specialty in underground construction, the kind of professional expertise that was in high demand in the classified defence establishment of the 1970s. when the Cold War competition in underground military infrastructure was at one of its peaks. His father, Oskar Schneider, had been a Navy captain with his own alleged connections to classified programs of the wartime and post-war period, connections that Philipp Schneider believed had shaped his own subsequent career in ways he did not fully understand until late in his life. Schneider worked on multiple underground construction projects in his career, and he was not, he insisted in his lectures, ever told the full purpose or context of the facilities he helped build. This was how the classification system worked, and worked deliberately. Engineers knew the specifications they were building to, the geological parameters they were working within, the structural requirements they needed to meet. They did not need to know and were not told what the facility was ultimately for. The knowledge was compartmentalized. The engineer built the structure. Someone else decided what went inside it. In August of 1979, Schneider was part of a construction crew working on an expansion of the underground installation near Dulce. The crew was operating at depth, drilling in an area that the geological survey data had indicated was unoccupied, a natural void or passage that, once connected to the existing installation, would add capacity to a level that was running at operational limits. The drilling proceeded normally for some time, and then the bore broke through. What was on the other side of the rock face that the drill penetrated was not an empty void. The chamber that the crew's lights illuminated when the bore opened was occupied, and the occupants were not human. Schneider described them consistently across his many lectures, with the repetitive detail of someone who has told the same story so many times that they are no longer embellishing it, just retrieving it. Approximately 7 feet tall, with a generally humanoid body plan but with proportions and features that were fundamentally wrong in ways that took a moment to fully register, because the wrongness was subtle before it was overwhelming. The hands had more fingers than human hands, and the fingers were longer and more mobile, and they terminated in something that was not quite a fingernail. The skin was a grey-green that did not look like skin. The eyes were large and dark and without any of the biological familiarity that makes eye contact between humans a form of communication. They were looking at the construction crew with an attention that was unmistakable and that conveyed, in Schneider's description, absolutely nothing that a human observer could reliably interpret as either hostile or benign. It was an attention that was simply total and completely opaque. What happened next happened very fast. Schneider could not, in his lectures, reconstruct the precise sequence of events with the confidence he would have liked, because the events moved at a speed and with a violence that compressed his memory of them into a sequence of impressions rather than a coherent narrative. There was a sound. There was movement. There was a confrontation between the entities and the construction crew and the military security personnel who were part of the installation's operating structure. There were weapons. Human weapons on one side and something that was not a conventional weapon on the other side. A directed energy discharge of some kind that Schneider described as producing a beam of blue-violet light that was hot in a way that was not quite the same as the heat of fire. He was struck by this discharge. He showed the audience the evidence, the hand with the missing fingers, the scars on his chest. He did not describe his injuries with any pleasure. He described them with the matter-of-fact directness of a man cataloguing damage that he had accepted and moved on from as well as he was able. By his account, 66 American military and construction personnel died in the incident. By his account, he was one of 3 survivors. By his account, the incident was classified at a level that made most top-secret clearances look like visitor badges under the administrative cover of the Department of Energy, which had jurisdiction over nuclear facilities and underground programs in ways that kept them insulated from the more conventional oversight mechanisms of the Department of Defense. By his account, the classification was not merely a matter of marking documents with the right stamps. It was a matter of the surviving witnesses receiving the kind of counselling, a word he used with deliberate irony, that ensured their ongoing silence, and of the families of those who died receiving the kind of explanation that was not an explanation but was accompanied by benefits, and a plausibility that made further questioning feel both pointless and dangerous. There is no official documentation of the 1979 Dulce War, no casualty records, no after-action reports, no Department of Energy communications that acknowledge the event. The absence of documentation is the wall that every serious researcher who has examined this story eventually arrives at, and what you make of that wall depends entirely on what you already believe about the capacity of the American national security apparatus to classify and suppress events that it does not wish the public to know about. That capacity is not hypothetical, it is historical fact. The United States government has classified and suppressed events of significant scale and consequence throughout the history of the national security state. Events that remain genuinely unknown to the public for decades before they eventually surface through declassification, through whistleblowers, through the slow erosion of institutional silence that time always produces. The MK-Ultra program, the human radiation experiments of the Atomic Energy Commission, the COINTELPRO operations against American civil rights organizations, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. These are not conspiracy theories, they are documented history. The classification and suppression of each of them was, at the time, considered internally justified by the agencies that conducted and concealed them. The people within those agencies who knew about them and said nothing were not, in most cases, monsters. They were professionals who had been trained in a culture of institutional silence and who applied that training to events that, had they been known publicly, would have generated consequences that the institutions wished to avoid. If the Dulce War occurred, if 66 people died in a tunnel beneath a mesa in northern New Mexico in August of 1979 during confrontation with non-human entities in a classified facility that no official document acknowledges exists, then its suppression would have required a classification effort that was aggressive, but not categorically different from suppression efforts that are known to have occurred in other contexts. More extreme in its subject matter, yes, but not more extreme in its institutional mechanisms. Philip Schneider began speaking publicly about his experiences in May of 1995. He gave approximately 30 lectures in the following 8 months, in locations across the Pacific Northwest and the broader American West, to audiences that range from small gatherings of dedicated UFO researchers to larger public presentations that drew people who had no particular prior interest in the subject, and who left, by the accounts of those who attended, with a significantly different relationship to the question of what their government might be doing without their knowledge. He was frightened when he spoke, not performatively frightened, not the theatrical fear of a man playing a role, but frightened in the specific and calibrated way of a person who has identified a specific and credible threat, and is responding to it with the last tool available to them, public exposure. He told his audiences that he had already survived, by his count, 13 assassination attempts since he had begun his public speaking. He told them that he had been contacted by people who made it clear that his continued public disclosure was being monitored by parties with the means and the demonstrated willingness to end it. He told them that he knew he was going to die, and that he wanted to die having said publicly what he knew, so that when it happened the people who were listening would understand what it meant. On January 17th, 1996, Philip Schneider was found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville, Oregon. He had been dead for approximately a week. The Clackamas County Medical Examiner, upon examination of the body and the scene, ruled the cause of death as suicide by self-strangulation. The method is worth pausing on. Self-strangulation, the compression of the carotid arteries or the trachea through force, applied by the person themselves, is one of the rarest methods of suicide documented in forensic literature. The reason is physiological. As consciousness begins to fail from oxygen deprivation, the muscle control necessary to maintain the compressive force dissipates, and the compression releases before death occurs. Completing a self-strangulation requires either a mechanical assist, a ligature attached to a fixed point, for example, which allows gravity to maintain the compressive force after voluntary muscular control is lost, or a level of sustained voluntary effort that is, in the clinical literature, essentially without precedent. The physical evidence at the scene, as described by Schneider's former wife Cynthia Schneider, who conducted her own investigation after the ruling was made, included a rubber catheter tube found around her former husband's neck. A catheter tube. Not a rope, not a cord, not a ligature of any description that is normally associated with fatal self-strangulation. A rubber catheter tube, which is a medical instrument, flexible and somewhat elastic, not the kind of material that a person planning to end their own life selects from among the options available to them. His medications were gone. He required several significant medications for health conditions that were documented and severe, and those medications were not in the apartment when the scene was processed. His papers, the notes, the documents, the accumulated research of years spent building the evidentiary foundation for his public claims, were not in the apartment. His government-issued safety deposit box, which he had told people contained his most sensitive materials, and which he had specifically described as containing documentation he intended to use in future lectures, had been emptied. Not cleaned out in the ordinary sense of a person settling their affairs. Emptied. Between the last time Schneider had been seen accessing it and the discovery of his death, someone had removed its contents. The suicide ruling stands in the official record. No investigation expanded to examine the questions raised by the missing medications, the missing papers, the missing safety deposit box contents. Philip Schneider was dead, and the official determination was that he had killed himself, and the institutions that might have been expected to take an interest in the anomalies surrounding that determination chose not to. The amplification of the Dulcie story that followed Schneider's death was partly a function of the story itself. He had been saying, publicly and repeatedly, that he was going to be killed for what he knew, and then he died under suspicious circumstances, and the logical inference that even sceptical observers had to at least consider was more than sufficient to sustain continued interest. But it was also a function of the other voices that had been adding to the narrative in the years before and after Schneider's death. Voices that gave the story a breadth and a density of allegation that made it impossible to dismiss as the product of a single unstable mind. John Lear was among the most significant of those voices, and he was among the most difficult to dismiss on the grounds of credibility. His father, William Lear, had been the founder of the Lear Jet Corporation, and one of the more consequential aviation entrepreneurs of the 20th century, a man whose technical innovations had shaped the industry. John Lear had grown up in that world and had built a career within it that was, by any conventional measure, impressive. Commercial pilot ratings across more than 100 different aircraft types, including some of the most demanding platforms in civilian and military aviation. Contracts with the CIA for flight operations in Southeast Asia, during the period when the agency was conducting activities in that region that were both extensive and not publicly acknowledged. A professional profile that gave him genuine access to the institutional culture of classified government operations and genuine credibility as a person who understood how that culture functioned. When Lear began making public statements in the late 1980s about what he claimed to know regarding the government's relationship with extraterrestrial entities, the statements were received with a seriousness that the same claims from a less credentialed source would not have received. He described the alleged 1954 treaty not as an equitable agreement between parties with broadly comparable interests, but as a fundamentally lopsided arrangement that had spiralled significantly beyond whatever the government had originally agreed to. The abduction provisions of the alleged treaty, he claimed, had been presented to Eisenhower's advisers as involving a small number of individuals, hundreds, perhaps, per year, selected non-randomly, with records kept and shared with the government, and with the individuals returned after examination without permanent harm. By the 1980s, according to Lear's account, the reality bore no resemblance to these terms. The numbers were not hundreds per year. The selection was not governed by any protocol that the government had agreed to or could monitor, and the return provision was not being honoured in any consistent way. The government's response to this situation in Lear's account was not confrontation. It was not a renegotiation of terms from a position of moral authority. It was accommodation, because the alternative to accommodation, open acknowledgement of what had been agreed to and what the agreement had produced, was a political and social catastrophe that no administration had been willing to contemplate. The cover-up was not, in this framework, a cover-up of something that had happened and been resolved. It was a cover-up of something that was ongoing, that was producing ongoing harm, and that the government was continuing to conceal, not because the situation had been managed, but because managing it was not something that anyone in the chain of institutional authority had figured out how to do. Lear's account introduced another element that would become a persistent thread in subsequent Dulce research. The suggestion that the underground installation near Dulce was not an isolated facility, but a node in a network of deep underground military bases, DUMBs in the acronym that researchers adopted, that extended across the continental United States in a system of tunnels and installations that constituted, if the accounts were accurate, the largest construction program in American history, conducted entirely in secret, without any public appropriation or oversight, funded through mechanisms that the conspiracy research community identified as including classified budget lines, drug trafficking proceeds, and the financial structures of intelligence community front organizations. The most famous node in this alleged network, beyond Dulce itself, was the complex beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, which was publicly known as the home of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and which the conspiracy framework positioned as the command and control hub of the DUM network. But the network allegedly extended far beyond Cheyenne Mountain and Dulce, to installations beneath the Nevada test site, beneath Fort Huachuca in Arizona, beneath Dulles Airport in Virginia, beneath the Denver International Airport, an institution that has generated its own extensive mythology in connection with underground facilities and whose official construction history contains anomalies that researchers have found worth examining. The tunnel connections between these alleged installations are described in the more detailed accounts as being the product of tunnel boring technology significantly in advance of anything available in the public domain, machines capable of boring tunnels of substantial diameter through solid rock, at speeds that would have required years of conventional construction to accomplish in weeks, using methods that either melted the surrounding rock into a glassy lining as they advanced. A process called nuclear subterranean tunneling, which was actually researched under that name at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the 1973 through 1975 period, producing patents that are publicly accessible, or employed the directed application of energy to fracture and remove rock in ways that conventional TBM technology could not match. The public record of nuclear subterranean research at Los Alamos is real. The patents are real. The technical papers describing the underlying principles are publicly available. What is not public, what remains classified or simply absent from the public record, is any evidence that the technology was deployed operationally, at scale, to build the tunnel network that the conspiracy framework describes. The gap between a research program that produced patents and a deployed operational system that built thousands of miles of high-speed underground transport tunnels is significant, and the evidence for what happened in that gap is, by the nature of the classification that allegedly surrounds it, essentially unavailable to independent researchers. The satellite and electromagnetic research of the 2000s and 2010s added new data layers to the Dulce story without resolving its fundamental questions. Researchers with access to commercial satellite imagery platforms, imagery that, by the early 2000s, had achieved a resolution that earlier generations of civilian researchers could not have imagined, began systematic analysis of the Archuleta Mesa area and its surroundings. The thermal imaging analysis produced heat signature maps of the mesa's surface that showed patterns the researchers found inconsistent with the known geothermal and biological activity of the region. Specific areas of the mesa showed elevated surface temperatures that were consistent in their spatial distribution and their temporal persistence, with heat being conducted upward from underground sources. The magnitude of the elevation was not enormous, not the kind of signature that a nuclear reactor venting heat directly to the surface would produce, but it was consistent across multiple imaging sessions conducted in different seasons and different weather conditions, and it was spatially patterned in ways that correlated with the reported layout of the underground installation. The electromagnetic anomaly research was conducted by a range of individuals with varying levels of technical expertise, from credentialed electrical engineers conducting systematic surveys to amateur radio operators tracking frequency anomalies in their home reception. The most technically rigorous of these investigations documented a recurring anomaly in the electromagnetic environment of the Dulce area, low-frequency signals with characteristics that did not match any known natural source and that did not correspond to any publicly allocated frequency use in the relevant spectrum. The modulation characteristics of these signals, the way they varied over time, were consistent with carrier wave communications rather than natural electromagnetic phenomena, suggesting that whatever was generating them was doing so for informational purposes. The signals could not be decoded by any method available to the researchers who detected them, but they could be tracked, and over time, the tracking produced the temporal correlation that several researchers documented with increasing confidence. The strongest signal events were clustered in temporal proximity to the periods of most intense regional cattle mutilation activity. The correlation does not prove causation. We want to be precise about that. But the correlation is real, and it is documented, and it is the kind of correlation that, in any other investigative context, would be considered a significant lead worthy of serious follow-up investigation. The serious follow-up investigation has not occurred, for the same reason that the serious investigation of Gabe Valdez's evidence did not occur. The institutional interest in examining the question does not exist, and without institutional interest the resources and access necessary for rigorous investigation are unavailable. Missing persons research in connection with the Dulce area has been conducted by a number of researchers over the decades, and it is among the most ethically fraught components of the entire investigation because it involves real people who really disappeared and whose families are real and whose suffering is real regardless of what ultimately explains the disappearances. We will treat this dimension of the story with the care it requires, the pattern that researchers have documented, and it is a documented pattern in the sense that the underlying data points are real, even if the pattern they allegedly form is subject to interpretive dispute, involves the geographic clustering of missing persons reports, cattle mutilation incidents, and UFO sighting reports in the region surrounding Dulce. The cluster analysis that several researchers have conducted shows a spatial concentration of all three phenomena in a radius centred on the Archuleta Mesa area that exceeds what random distribution of the underlying events would be expected to produce. The concentration is most pronounced for the periods of highest cattle mutilation activity, the mid-1970s through early 1980s, but it persists at a lower intensity in subsequent decades. The researchers who have examined this pattern are careful, in the more responsible accounts, not to assert that all or most of the missing persons cases are connected to the alleged underground installation. People disappear in rural areas for many reasons, and the statistical challenge of separating a genuine signal from a noisy dataset without controlled methodology is significant. What they assert is more modest, that the pattern is real, that it warrants investigation, and that the investigation has not occurred, that the families of people who disappeared in the Dulce area during the periods of highest anomalous activity have not, in most cases, received explanations that satisfy them, and that institutional agencies responsible for investigating disappearances have not, in those cases, conducted investigations of the depth and diligence that the families had reason to expect. The connection between the alleged biological research program at the Dulce installation and the legitimate genetic research programs at Los Alamos and Sandia is one of the more structurally interesting threads in the conspiracy framework, because it operates not through the kind of direct causal claim that can be straightforwardly evaluated, but through an architectural argument about institutional proximity and personnel overlap. Los Alamos National Laboratory's publicly acknowledged research portfolio in the 1970s and 1980s included, alongside its primary mission in nuclear weapons, a growing program in what the institution called biological research, molecular biology, genetics, biomedical applications of radiation technology. This was not hidden. It was published. but the specific nature of some of this research and the specific techniques employed remained classified in ways that the institution justified on national security grounds without specifying the nature of the security concern. The conspiracy argument does not suggest that Los Alamos scientists were conducting hybrid experiments in their public laboratory. It suggests something more architecturally subtle, that the personnel pipelines between Los Alamos and the alleged Dulce installation ran in both directions, that researchers who had demonstrated specific expertise in genetic techniques within the public program were identified as candidates for classified work that used those techniques in ways that the public program was not permitted to pursue, and that the institutional culture of Los Alamos, with its decades of practice at keeping secrets at the highest classification levels, provided the human infrastructure for a program that went far beyond anything the institution could publicly acknowledge. The timeline is suggestive in ways that researchers have found difficult to ignore. The most technically sophisticated hybridization experiments alleged to have occurred at the Dulce installation are said to have taken place in the early to mid-1980s. The public scientific community achieved the first successful demonstrations of recombinant DNA technology in the mid-1970s, and the first human gene was cloned in 1977. The pace of public genetic research in the early 1980s was extraordinary by the standards of the scientific community, but it was still orders of magnitude behind what the Dulce accounts describe as having been achieved within the classified program by the same period. The gap between the public timeline and the alleged classified timeline is either evidence that the classified program had access to technologies and insights that the public scientific community did not, which is what the treaty framework alleges, or it is evidence that the classified timeline is fabricated. There is no position from which that question can currently be answered with certainty. The document that surfaced in the 2020 era, circulating in the more dedicated corners of the UFO and Dulce research community, has been described above. We will add some detail here. The document is formatted in a style consistent with classified government memoranda of the relevant period, a specific header structure, a classification marking system, a distribution list that uses alphanumeric designations rather than agency names. The language is the language of bureaucratic understatement, the flat, affectless prose in which classified government communications discuss the most extraordinary subjects as though they were procurement decisions or administrative updates. The document refers to a subsurface facility in northern New Mexico in terms that treat its existence as an established fact, requiring no explanation or justification, only administrative attention. It refers to the non-human occupants of the facility in a single sentence that describes them as a party to an agreement, in the specific legalistic sense of a party to a contract, which implies a negotiated relationship rather than either a captive or an equal participant relationship. And it notes, in the final substantive paragraph, that the joint occupancy agreement governing the facility has been renewed, not initiated, not re-established after a lapse, renewed. The language of continuity, the language of a relationship that has been ongoing long enough to require periodic administrative renewal rather than periodic justification for its existence. The language of something that has become, in the context of the institution that produced the document, simply part of the ongoing operational landscape, a management matter rather than a policy decision. The document may be genuine. The document may be a sophisticated fabrication. We cannot determine which. What we can note is that its language, its format, and its specific bureaucratic register are all consistent with the kind of institutional communication that the described facility, if it exists, would generate, and that the question of its authenticity is one that the relevant institutions have neither confirmed nor denied, because their consistent position is that there is nothing to confirm or deny. We come finally to the Mercer itself. We come to the experience of standing on the surface of the thing, of placing your feet on rock that has been in this place for longer than the human species has existed, and that may, if a fraction of what is alleged about it is true, be concealing something, that changes everything we believe about our place in the universe and the nature of the world we inhabit. Imagine it. Late afternoon on a day in early autumn, when the high desert light is doing what it always does at that hour and that season, turning every surface it touches into something that glows from within. Amber and gold and a deep reddish brown that makes the rock look like it is retaining the summer for one last afternoon before releasing it to the coming cold. You have driven the roads that are accessible, walked the distance from the last point where a vehicle can go, climbed the lowest slopes of the mesa through juniper and piñons that thin out as the elevation increases and the soil becomes too shallow and too rocky for deep root systems. You have your equipment, a compass, a Geiger counter, a sensitive magnetometer, a recorder for your notes and observations. You have your research. 50 years of it, gathered from the accounts of people who came before you, and from the documented evidence that no official investigation has adequately addressed, and from the deep personal conviction that things that have been kept hidden deserve the effort of people willing to look. The mesa's surface at the higher elevations is a landscape of weathered rock and sparse vegetation, beautiful in the specific way that high desert landscapes are beautiful, austere, honest, requiring no softness to be striking. The silence here is the particular silence of high elevation and remoteness, a silence with genuine depth, the kind that takes several minutes to fully sink into consciousness as you move from the noise of the road into the stillness of the open land. But there is something else in the silence, something that does not quite belong to it, a low-frequency vibration that is below the threshold of hearing but not below the threshold of physical perception, a quality in the rock beneath your boots that suggests, not loudly, not with any certainty that would satisfy a skeptic, that the rock is not simply sitting there in the passive stability of geological matter, but is transmitting something, conducting something from below. The vibration is not consistent, it pulses, not rapidly, not with any rhythm that the human ear would recognize as musical or mechanical, but with a slow, deep periodicity that seems, as you track it over time, to be related to something below rather than around you. The compass needle does not point north. It points northeast consistently, by approximately 15 degrees of deviation from the expected bearing, and the deviation does not change as you move across the surface of the mesa, which means it is not a local magnetic anomaly produced by a specific surface feature, but something that is generating a consistent magnetic influence over a wide area from a source whose depth and character you cannot determine with the equipment you have. The magnetometer confirms the anomaly and adds detail. The field is not static. It oscillates at a frequency that the instrument can measure, but that you cannot source to any natural magnetic phenomenon you're aware of that would produce this specific combination of magnitude, consistency, and oscillatory frequency at this location. The Geiger counter ticks at a rate that is elevated above the background level expected at this elevation and in this geological context. Not dramatically elevated, not the kind of reading that would indicate acute exposure to a radiation source, but elevated in a way that is consistent with radioactive material at depth, the kind of reading that the rock above a nuclear-powered underground installation might produce as a function of the slow upward diffusion of radiogenic gases through the overlying geology. The sky above the mesa in the late afternoon and early evening of a clear autumn day is extraordinary. The altitude and the remoteness from artificial light sources combine to produce a clarity and a depth of field that renders the visible stars as they begin to emerge as genuine objects at genuine distances rather than the flat printed quality they have when seen through the atmospheric haze and light pollution of populated areas. You can see the structure of the galaxy. You can see with the naked eye objects that human beings did not know existed before the invention of the telescope. The sky is not a backdrop. It is a volume of space that extends in every direction and contains things that are real and specific and present. And the awareness of this, the awareness that you are standing on a planet in a galaxy, in a universe that is incomprehensibly large and that has been producing the conditions for life and intelligence for billions of years, is something that the specific context of this place renders immediate and impossible to push back into the comfortable abstraction where most of us keep it most of the time. And then, in the darkness above the northern ridge of the mesa, there is a light. Not a star. Stars are fixed and constant and do not pulse with the slow, deliberate periodicity that this light displays. Not an aircraft. Aircraft carry navigation lights that flash in regulated patterns and move across the sky in trajectories that reflect the physics of flight. This light is stationary. This light pulses once every several seconds, with a regularity that suggests intention rather than natural phenomenon, and it is positioned above the ridge at an angle and an altitude that would place its source, if it were on the ground rather than in the air, at a specific point on the mesa's upper surface that correlates, according to the research you have done, with one of the areas where thermal imaging has shown elevated temperature signatures. The light disappears. The silence returns, or rather what was always the silence returns, because the silence never actually left. It was always there beneath the vibration and the magnetic anomaly and the elevated radiation count and the unexplained light, the profound and ancient quiet of a place that has been in this form for 200 million years and will be in some form for 200 million more, regardless of what has been built within it and what agreements have been renewed in the offices of institutions whose names do not appear in public records. You stand on the rock. The ground hums beneath your feet with the patient persistence of something that has been humming for decades, something that does not need you to acknowledge it because it was never conducting its operations for your benefit. The compass needle holds its 15-degree deviation without apology. The Geiger counter ticks. The stars continue to emerge in numbers that remind you of your scale, and you understand, standing here, that the question you came to ask is not going to be answered tonight, is not going to be answered by standing on a mesa in the dark with consumer-grade instruments and 50 years of other people's research filed in your mind. The answer, if it exists, is below you. It is behind whatever barrier has been placed between the surface world and the operations that the evidence suggests are being conducted beneath it. It is in the files that do not appear in FOIA requests, and the documents that have been removed from evidence chains, and the papers that were missing from a dead man's apartment, and the safety deposit box that was emptied before anyone could examine its contents. But standing here, with the vibration in your feet and the light gone now from the ridge and the silence of the high desert, holding everything in its deep, old, knowing quiet, you understand something that the files and the research and the testimony of the dead and the living does not quite convey in the abstracted form of written accounts. You understand it physically. You feel it in the rock beneath your boots. Whatever is beneath Archuleta Mesa is still there. It has always been there. It was there before Gabe Valdez documented his first mutilation. It was there before the drilling equipment appeared and disappeared in the mid-1970s. It was there when Philip Schneider broke through the rock face and found what was waiting on the other side. It was there through the decades of investigation and the deaths and the suppression and the accumulated weight of half a century of questions that no official body has ever genuinely tried to answer. It is there now, and the document, genuine or fabricated, that circulates in the research community, with the language of administrative continuity, joint occupancy agreement renewed, suggests that it will be there, under whatever new terms the renewal entails, for the foreseeable future. The question is not whether it is there. The question is what it wants. And the deeper question, the question that the treaty framework raises and does not answer, is whether what it wants and what we agree to give it are still the same thing, or whether in the decades since the agreement was first made, the terms have shifted in ways that we are not in a position to renegotiate. The night deepens, the stars multiply, the ground hums, and somewhere below, in the dark and the depth and the silence of a place that has no name in any public document and no location on any map that civilians are permitted to see, something continues to happen. Something that began before most of the people alive today were born. Something that has outlasted administrations and treaties and the careers and lives of the people who built it, and the people who investigated it, and the people who died trying to tell what they found. Something that is, in the flat bureaucratic language of a memorandum whose provenance cannot be established, but whose language carries the specific gravity of institutional truth, still operational. The Mesa holds its silence. The stars hold their positions. The compass needle holds its deviation.